Morning.
Good morning, Chair. We start with the evidence of Ms Colburn.
Thank you, Ms Moore.
If you'd like to repeat after me, I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Good morning, Ms Colburn. Can we start with your full name, please?
Jacqueline Gayford Colbran.
And you should have a folder there in front of you, which I see you've got. I might refer you to documents therein, but they'll also be shown in the screen that you see in front of you on your left. What you do have at tab 1 that you might want to have open is your witness statement, which is a statement you made to the inquiry and you signed on the 13th of February 2022. And that statement will be adduced in full. The reference for it is Imb 000204. What that means is we don't need to go through everything that's said in your witness statement. We're going to focus on some of the areas of particular interest where you can assist the inquiry. So, Ms Colburn, you were chair of the Brook House IMB during the relevant period.
Yeah, correct.
You discussed in the statement your background and life experience and how that led to your interest in joining the IMB. So you've lived in a number of countries, you have some personal experience of navigating the UK immigration system yourself, and you have, you say, also an interest in human rights. So you were a member of Amnesty and the Central America Human Rights Group. And you had a varied career, involving social work in hospitals, organising sheltered housing for the elderly and running a riding school as well. And as you say in your statement, from 2004, you were a lay observer, so in the court system. And in 2006, you joined the IMB, but this was at Highdown, and that's a men's prison, isn't it, in Surrey? And we've heard, obviously, about the IMB already in the course of the inquiry, but by way of recap, and this is from the statement of Dame Anne Hours, so she's the national chair of the IMB. She explains that IMBs for immigration removal centres were established under the Immigration and Asylum Act, and their duties are defined in the detention centre rules. And while the legislation refers to visiting committees, we now call that IMBs, Independent Monitoring Boards. She says, in summary, members are appointed by the Secretary of State. They have free access to speak privately to all detained individuals and to see all documents except for certain healthcare documents. And staff personnel records and other classified information. But other than that, can see all the documents held in the centre. They must satisfy themselves as to the state of the detention centre premises, the administration of the detention centre, and the treatment of the detained people. They must report to the Secretary of State annually, so that's by the way of annual reports, which we've heard referred to, and also immediately if they find abuse. And they should, within 24 hours, visit detained individuals who are removed from association, subject to temporary confinement or special control or restraint, and they must hear complaints or requests from detained persons. So that's the sort of overview of what the IMB does and must do. So you join the IMB, additionally at Highdown Prison, and you discuss at paragraph 5 of your statement the training you initially received, which was a 2-day residential course. And was that with other people who were hoping to join the IMB?
Yes,
And was it something that you would sort of pass or fail, or was it just a course that you had to complete?
it was just a course.
And at the time you did the training, you say in your statement, it wasn't specific to Prison versus Immigration Removal Centre. It was the same training for everyone. You also undertook shadowing and mentoring. And I understand it's quite a long probationary period where you do that.
Yeah.
So for a year you were on probation.
Well, say half of that you're shadowing, and the second half you're on probation, but alive in the centre on your own. It's a phased-in affair.
And when you're shadowing, do you always shadow the same person on their visits, or do you shadow different people?
Different people.
And you say you became the vice chair of the IMB at Highdown in 2009 and then became chair there in 2011. And you say you completed the recommended 3 years. So is that the general idea? The chair will generally serve for 3 years as chair,
Yes,
and then be
that's
replaced.
recommended.
Then you applied to join the board at Brook House in 2014. Was there any sort of need to redo training or shadowing or mentoring, or do you
No.
sort of transfer through?
No.
So you only do that for your first position?
Yes, because there was going to be no difference from one chair's course to another at that stage. Things have changed now.
And you describe at the time in your statement that Brookhouse IMB was in dire straits, and I think that's in terms of numbers. Of members. Without going into huge detail about this, because it is a little time before the relevant period, but I understand that over the 4 years after you joined, you built up a larger membership, so up to 9 people eventually.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about the process of recruiting IMB volunteers? So how's it done? How do you get new people to join?
It's mainly done through the secretariat, the IMB secretariat. So Dick Weber, who was one of our members, was the person responsible for recruitment.
Yep.
And so he would liaise with them, and they would put out the adverts. And at the relevant period, I think things were taking an awful long time. Again, I would hope that things are better now, but the whole recruitment process from the formal side took a long time. We would hear who the candidates were. We would be told who the independent interviewer would be on the panel. It was all set up for us once we'd initiated or indicated a need for recruitment.
So do you know where, for example, the advertisements for members would be?
Well, I think they were moving to online.
Right. And you may not know, but you said you got an idea of who the candidates were. Do you know what sort of profile of applicants you got for the post in terms of, their working background or their
Well,
age?
only when they arrived for an interview,
Yeah.
we'd find out from them.
And did you see trends?
We were very lucky, having been involved in recruitment at Highdown, where it really was a white professional retired profile. We were very lucky in being able to attract a completely different, a very varied kind of profile of person.
And was that intentional to try and get more of a varied?
It would always have been desirable,
Yeah.
but we were very pleased.
The inquiry has been assisted by expert evidence. So we have one of the experts, Professor Bosworth, who's made suggestions in her report and discusses the IMB. And at paragraph 10.34, she says, my suggestion for the IMB would be to recruit more widely, including from the population of those who've been previously detained. Do you have any view on whether that would be an attractive option for the IMB?
Always.
Do you know if that's something that was ever done?
No, I don't know. Basically, it was done by the secretariat. They were obviously committed to diversity, so it was really who applied.
But people who've been previously detained will have a completely different experience and be able to share a different perspective, presumably.
Yes.
And she also says at 10.34, I recommend also that they offer remuneration for their members to allow a more diverse group to take up the position. Do you have any view on that?
Not really, no.
Do you think that there are people who maybe are precluded from joining because of the expense or needing to take time off work?
There is a provision, or there was a provision for paying people for missing work, and people in certain jobs could expect time off in order to. So some of our members, not many, but were actually working, and in fact the two I'm thinking of didn't need to seek financial, but yes, it would help. It would help attract people who were needed money.
So you say some members, but not many were working. So most of your members were not working because they were either retired or otherwise didn't have jobs.
That's correct.
What's the sort of time commitment? We'll go on to talk about the weekly rotas, but how many sort of days a year would you expect, not the chair, but a normal member to need to commit to their role on the IMB?
Well, it would be the 1 to 2 days on Rotor, which might crop up every 4 to 6 weeks, 6 weeks. And then there'd be the monthly board meeting, and then there would be other events, activities, training.
20, 25 days a year, maybe?
Yes.
And we'll talk about, obviously, the number of times you need to attend depends on how big the IMB is as well, doesn't it? Because the more members you have, the less frequently you're on Rotor. Is that right?
That would be logical, yes.
And just regarding IMB members with backgrounds in prisons, this is also mentioned by Professor Bosworth. a number of IMB members had either previously been at IMBs based in prisons or worked within the prison system themselves. Do you feel that influenced their view of the detained people? So did they
Simply
have
no.
Simply
no. It was useful to have some people with a prison background because they would understand the journey of some of the people who were detained. So it was very useful. Because of our shortage, we were able to bring in people who were already trained up in the prison system, and that was a huge advantage at that point.
So trained up as in they'd already done, you had an IMB role in the prison. And obviously the nature of detention in immigration detention is different from prison detention.
Yes,
it's not
correct.
punitive and there's
Yeah.
no criminal reason to be there. Was there any particular way in which the IMB ensured that IMB members coming from a prison background understood the different nature of detention? I think you said the training course was the same for everybody. Was there any sort of, well, here's why it's different when you join a different IMB?
Well, this would have come out for somebody coming in ready trained from a prison. It would be verbal.
Right.
It would be how we explained, because they couldn't come in and start work immediately the first day, so there would be a shadowing process.
So thinking about the relevant period now, I'm going to ask about the weekly visits that we've already alluded to. And this is a requirement of the detention centre rules, it's Rule 63.1, that board members are required to visit the IRC frequently, and that's at least once a week. These are known as the Rotor visits. So you discussed this at paragraph 13, that Brook House was afforded a total of 193 visits in 2017. And can you help us with what you mean by afforded? I think there's a kind of expenses profile. Is that why?
Yes.
So what do you mean by afforded? How does it work in terms of that limiting the amount of visits?
At the beginning of a financial year, we would be told the sort of number, well, the allocation of visits that we had. And at the end of the year, we'd be told how we'd scored. I mean, that's my memory. I think it was 2. It might have all come in one document at the end of the year when they were telling us how many we had for the next year and telling us how many we'd overrun on the previous year.
Who was telling you that?
And well, it would come out from the Secretariat, but it was the National Council.
So is that because you get a certain amount of, obviously your travel, I think expenses are paid through the IMB, but
Yes.
by the Secretary of State, I suppose, at the top. And there's a certain pot of money, and that relates to a certain amount of visits, and if you do any more, you've gone over.
Yes.
And from the number of visits that you are afforded, it's not just rota visits, is it? The statutory attendance at board meetings is deducted from that
That's
total.
included, yes.
But there's no limit, you say, on urgent or unplanned visits to attend serious incidents.
Correct.
Just turning to your average rota visit, you say in 2017 it would work out at 1.6 visits a week, so 1 or 2 visits a week, which accords with the Rule 63. And as we can see from the Rotor report, some of which we'll come to look at, one member would be the visitor for a week, and then there'd be also the one who was on call, and they might go once or more, and then they'd complete a...
That was the same person.
Yes.
There was just the one person who
Yeah.
would be on rota and on call, yes?
Yes, yeah, they'd also be on call,
Yes,
yeah.
sorry.
And they'd also complete a weekly report for the week beginning when they were on rota. Would that be different from the chair, or would you also go on the weekly rota like everyone else?
I would go on out with everybody else.
And the weekly visit process is set out at your paragraph 17, so page 7. You say that the IMB had keys, they would have access to the centre, and they would visit wings, wing offices, the kitchen, healthcare. They'd collect IMB applications or complaint forms. They'd eat a meal on one of the wings. And as we'll come to in more detail soon, during these visits, you would speak to detainees and consider applications, so that's written or oral requests to speak from detainees.
Yes.
And then on a different day, you'd attend the centre to go to IMB meetings.
Yes.
And we'll look at some of those meetings and also the information you had when you attended them. And then finally, as I've said, you could be called to attend the centre urgently if you're on rota as well. So if a serious incident happens, you go there and attend. Before we turn to the detail of that, I want to ask about another organisation at Brook House, which is the Gatwick Detainee Welfare Group. So I understand you've been following some of the evidence in the inquiry so far. Did you have a chance to listen to the evidence of Miss Pincus or Mr.
Yes.
Wilson? You cover this as well at page 50 of your statement. And at paragraph 146 to 147, you mentioned that relations during the relevant period and thereabouts between G4S, the Home Office, and GDWG were poor and were characterised by a lack of trust and concern about what both G4S and the Home Office management considered to be highly inappropriate actions by GDWG. Do you know what actions were thought to be highly inappropriate?
One or two things. Well, because it was right at the very beginning. I think I remember there were two particular ones, but then there were others that came in later that I heard about.
And what was the general nature of those actions?
They were varied. One of them was that the director had brought into the centre the mayor without permission.
Mayor?
The mayor of somewhere, a local mayor, into the centre without going through the relevant channels.
Right.
Can't remember. Sorry.
That's okay. Do you remember whether you personally felt that those actions were highly inappropriate?
It was nothing to do with us.
It was just the feeling from the
It was
Home Office.
what we were being told. Yes.
I see. And you note in paragraph 148 that you didn't see much of GDWG, as there was still difficulty seeing or inviting their members into the centre, and that was because of, you say, the suspicion in which they were held by the Home Office and G4S.
Yes, correct.
Do you know, how long did that level of suspicion last? Was it until you left?
Yes, I would say so.
Which was?
At least until the relevant period,
Yep.
or at least until the November of that year when we had what I thought was a clearing up meeting. Sorry, have I answered that?
No, that's fine. Yeah, and we say Home Office, but obviously it's people, isn't it? So who was it from the Home Office or from G4S that you considered?
Well, it was the senior management, so it was Steve Skitt and Ben Saunders and Paul Gasson.
Do you consider that this impacted GDWG's ability to provide its visiting and welfare services to people?
Not the visiting.
Any other services?
Well, I wasn't even aware that they had the use of a room until fairly late on, so I wasn't aware of that side of their work.
So this is we've heard it described as the drop-in room, so have the initial assessment, I see. And you didn't know that was supposed to be or was part of their job. Good. You go on at 163 to address Mr McPherson's suggestion that during the relevant period, Gatwick detainees, so paragraph 163, page 56. Mr McPherson's suggestion that during the relevant period, Gatwick Detainee Welfare Group were told by IMB not to make complaints to the IMB, and you said that's not right. The issues were in fact the nature of the complaints. What do you mean by the nature of the complaints?
Well, it was in general, it was that the complaints were coming to us rather than via the safer custody manager, who would be able to take immediate action.
Is there a problem with it coming to both of you?
No, on the contrary. That was what was beaten out eventually in November 2017.
And did you ever have a view as to why they might have been coming to you rather than to the safer custody team?
Well, no, I had no evidence to suggest why they were doing it.
But you were aware of the difficult relationship
I
between...
was aware of the difficult relationship between management, but that's not the same thing as between the safer custody manager.
I see, and you also discussed the manner in which they were being made was an issue, which was unsecure email, you say?
Yes, that's
Do you know
true.
whether there was any attempt to resolve that, or would that not have been within your remit?
No, that wouldn't have been within our remit.
And you mention at 151 to 152 that there was a problem, as you say, when Gatwick Detainee Welfare Group were raising concerns directly with the IMB. What would you be able to do when this did happen? Did you pass on those concerns immediately?
Well, we did take action immediately as soon as we heard what they were saying. Very often these were situations that we were already involved in anyway. But if I was going into the centre, I would deal with it myself and go and see whoever was involved in it and find out what the situation really was. And if I wasn't going to be in the centre, I would ring the person on duty for that week and ask them to deal with the matter.
And if we can have on screen, please, IMB 000003. And there we go, and page 4, please. So this is from the minutes of a board meeting on the 16th of August 2017, so quite near the end of the relevant period, and under, obviously, the heading there, Gatwick Detainee Welfare Group. You mention, towards the end of the 4th line there, like the board, Home Office and G4S managers absolutely recognise the immensely good work GDWG does supporting detainees, and then say, the problem for HO/G4S is one of trust, and hinges around the question of whether the organisation sees itself as existing to befriend detainees or as a protest movement against detention. And then you say, having had a few conversations on the subject this week, Steve, Paul, Michelle B, I propose we have it on the agenda. So that's, you've helped us, Steve, Skit, Paul Gasson, and would Michelle B be Michelle Brown? And you say trust is an issue, as well as whether GDWG was a protest movement. Were these things that you were hearing from the Home Office and G4S, or were they
Yes.
the views of the IMB?
They weren't thoughts from the IMB.
Why would it be an issue for the IMB to sort of consider or to write in this way about the relationship between those two parties?
We were very concerned that the Gatwick Detainees Group had a good relationship in the centre. It was to everybody's advantage. And I thought by the board discussing it with senior managers there, it might, well, for one thing, it would all be recorded, and we would hopefully be able to move on from that.
I want to now, thank you, you can take that down, thank you, move to some specific events. So firstly, the increase in beds, so the increase in capacity. You cover this in your statement at page 49, paragraph 144. And you say that there was a proposal about increasing beds, which was talked about in or around 2014 initially. And then you say the second time it was talked about, the Home Office appeared to have already made its mind up. But at the point where you felt that they'd already made their mind up, had the beds already been installed?
No.
And you say, I would expect we made some sort of informal protest, and I spoke against it at the Chairs Forum and in the annual report. Do you think, looking back, there could have been a more formal approach to resisting that decision?
Yes.
And would that have included, well, you tell me, how can you go about recording a formal concern?
Well, we did record it because we recorded it in the annual report for
Yes.
the Minister, and we recorded it at the forum in front of Alan Gibson, the enforcement director. So I suppose it's a bit difficult to know what else we could have done.
You can write to the Secretary of State or the Minister.
Well, except
sorry.
that he'd already seen it in the annual report, of course.
So going to the annual report then, you mentioned it in the 2016 report, but all I could see from that report was that it said at paragraph 3.1, preparations have been made to increase capacity, and at 3.3, that preparations are in place to accommodate 3 residents in 60 of the rooms through bunk beds. Was there anything in the report that I've missed?
I thought there was more, but you might be right.
You also mentioned it at the Chairs Forum, which you
Yes.
say in your statement. And just to cover what that is, it's mentioned in more detail in Miss Molyneux's statement, but it's a quarterly forum, isn't it, where
Yes.
chairs of the IMBs across the estate and also Home Office officials attend. Do you know who from the Home Office would attend such forums?
Alan Gibson.
Yeah. So your account to the Chairs Forum in April 2017 is covered in your statement at 64, but it's quite long, so perhaps we can have that on the screen as well. It's IMB 000204. And if we go to page 22 of that document when it's ready, please. So this is, as your statement you also have in front of you, paragraph 64 from the top, yeah. And the indented sections there are what you said to the Chairs Forum. So in April 2017, the long expected ramp up of the 60 extra beds is currently underway with an increase in OPCAP of 10 each week. You say that plans are in place to increase educational provision, number of jobs, etc. We will, of course, be monitoring the effect on the centre. Brook is still benefiting from the extra Tinsley staff giving a good feeling to the centre. And you say another ITC course is running. So there's nothing in there about being concerned about the increase in beds, is there?
No.
Do you think there should have been?
I think it was understood. There was a discussion And so all the other chairs would have been very well aware of what this signified.
But it doesn't really matter what the other chairs think, does it? It's the Home Office who needs to know that you have concerns.
Well, if we had the discussion, the Home Office would have been aware.
Oh, but there's no record of
No,
the discussion.
there were minutes taken from this meeting, but I don't have them.
But it's not in the written report that you gave.
No.
And then again, we see in July 2017, so if we scroll down a little, you say that the effect of the increase in population, 60 extra beds, and the loss of the extra staff because they moved back to Tinsley when it reopened, was slow to be felt, but I think it's true to say that the optimism is now in July over, and the centre is experiencing one of the annual cycles where staff feel pressured and appear thin on the ground. There's no record also of the fact that you hadn't been formally consulted or of the concerns that you say you raised in 2014, which had been ignored. Is that something that it might have been pertinent to put in the report?
Yes, it could have been.
Would it be fair to say that what we see here, and also in the 2016 report, if my reading of it is correct, it's less of a critique of a policy that you now say you did oppose, and it's simply reciting the plans of the Home Office?
Yes.
And just one last point on that. You mentioned annual cycles where the staff feel pressured and low on the ground. Was that your experience of staffing, that it would be kind of cyclical?
Yes.
Do you know what gave rise to annual changes like that?
Attrition and then recruitment.
Why would that be annual?
It seemed to, I mean, if we'd, it might have been plottable on a graph, but it seemed to be that every year at some stage there would be a lot of staff leaving and a recruitment plan in operation.
Most people who discussed staffing to the inquiry, who I know you've listened to, agreed that staffing was low, but I believe said it was low generally rather than that there were peaks. People talk about their concerns.
That was certainly my impression. During 2017, the situation was different because there was the Tinsley reopening and the ramp up of the beds, so that was a much more acute period.
I see. Were there periods when you were there that you thought it was well staffed?
There were periods from the time I started when there were 3 officers on a wing.
Right. Do you consider that to be adequate?
Which are not necessarily adequate, because the more, obviously, the more officers, but it felt that this was the number that the Home Office and G4S were supposed to put in place.
I see, and less than that would be the lower levels.
That's when it really got testing for staff.
You cover staffing also more generally from page 20 under the heading staffing. And at page 21, paragraph 63, you say that staffing was a great concern to you. We don't need that, thank you, take it down. And that its effects, you mentioned specifically on page 23, and you talk about various Rotor reports from April and October 2017 where you discussed low staffing. So you discuss the lack of officers being on the wing. That's recorded at the time as well in the Rotor reports. Long waits for survey workers to be let out after their
that was one,
shifts.
yes,
one example. And you say it's not too good for morale, which is your comment in the October report. Do you know if that meant sort of staff morale?
Yes.
It's also not good, is it, for detained
For the detainees,
persons?
correct.
So if they need some help or something happens, there's not enough people there to deal with it potentially.
Yes.
And you mention also roll call miscounting and then recounting, which you mentioned at page 70. And I think that was held up, wasn't it, by the low levels of staffing on occasion?
I don't think that was necessarily, it was a miscount.
Miscount.
So, it's, in my experience, it was a miscount. So they had to go and count again.
Is that related to staffing or is it just an operational
Not
issue?
necessarily. I mean, you could say that if there are only 2 officers on a wing and they had 3 landings to do, it would take longer. But that wouldn't necessarily mean that they can't. When they look, they have to open the shutter and look through and count, and then just relay that number through.
And a different point about staff morale and staff culture, I'll ask for this to be on the screen. It's IMB 000204, but page 66, please. And this again is from your statement, so it's page 66 at 193. Turning to kind of the effects of staffing morale and also the nature of the staff. You say at 193, if we could show 193 and 194. In my view, the causes of the behaviour shown in Panorama were rooted in collusion, a fear of repercussions if members of staff grasped, and macho culture and banter not being challenged before it got worse. So collusion, do you mean officers covering up abuse
For each
over?
other, yes.
Is that something you were ever aware of before Panorama?
No.
Maybe not physical abuse, but maybe a lack of transparency?
No.
Did you ever
No.
get the feeling that staff would rather close ranks than raise concerns about their colleagues?
No.
What about repercussions if staff grassed? Were you aware of that?
No.
Were you ever aware of staff being treated differently for raising concerns?
No, I was aware, for example, of Owen.
Sight read.
Yes, being off sick for stress, and that was in later 2017. But I didn't. We weren't given details on staff matters.
Did you know anything about why he was off?
I'm not sure if Mary didn't have a conversation with him. You could ask her.
Sure.
But once he was not there, we didn't know. We were trying to get him to come to a board meeting, to talk to us about the pilot project or his role in it, and we could never catch him because he was off so much.
I see. And did you hear anyone else talking about his absence?
No. Informing that he wasn't around, yes, when we asked.
But not the detail?
But no details.
And also you mentioned macho culture. Is that something that you're aware of during your time at the Brook House?
Not a culture. Not a culture. No.
Macho behaviour?
They when I sat through a kitting up session, for example, ready to go out on a planned incident, they would talk among themselves, but there was never anything untoward in the conversation while I was there.
Talk amongst themselves in a macho way?
They would joke and banter in the correct meaning of the term.
About
Among
the event that's about to
themselves.
happen?
No. Just to
Yeah.
pass the time, because there's an awful lot of waiting in one of those situations.
But not in front of you, anything that gave you concern about what was about to happen?
Absolutely not.
That blokey
No.
chat? Sorry.
Blokey chat for themselves.
Blokey chat for themselves,
yes,
yeah.
yes.
And then at the next paragraph, 194, you describe the first line there. The general atmosphere at Brook House was inevitably coarsening for staff. And then you discuss how in prison it's different because men can look forward to release, whereas that's not the case in detention. What do you mean by the phrase there, it was coarsening for staff?
The demands, the atmosphere, the reactions of the detained persons, the requirement, well, just the length of the shifts. It was draining.
Is that what coarsening is potentially a synonym for being drained and a bit worn down by it?
It's drained in a bad sense.
And is that something you felt at the time, not just looking back?
That's a judgment after the event, the coarsening, but they were certainly drained.
And did you have any concern on how the staff profile, being people who were drained and working long shifts, how that would affect their ability to care for detainees?
Yes.
How did you raise that?
Well, it was raised in our Rotor reports. It was raised in board meetings.
Would you refer to specific staff that you had concerns about, or would it be more of a general?
It would have been more general. It might have been based on comments that we'd picked up going around the centre, but I don't think I ever attached a name to it.
You can turn it up if you wish. I won't ask for it to be shown, and that can be taken down now. But you mention also collusion again at paragraph 39, page 14, where you say a lot is demanded of the officers, and it's understandable that they would seek support from each other and develop very strong links. However, there is clearly a danger that this team spirit can slip into collusion. And it's not just a danger, is it? That's what we saw happened. We saw the video of Jan Pashali and D1527 and no one stopping him. You know, the use of the N-word about detainees. People saying if he dies, he dies. It's not an extreme version of team spirit, is it? It's something a bit different to that.
Yes.
I want to ask about the HMIP and 2016 report now. We discussed the increase in beds already and briefly mentioned the 2016 Imb report. And HMIP, who we heard from yesterday, attended Brook House for an inspection in 2016 from the 31st of October till the 11th of November. Can we have on screen, please, HMIP 000148. Thank you. So this is a chain of emails, which means you need to read it from the bottom up. So if we have page 2 on first, please. Thank you. This is an email from you to Mr. Singbui, who we heard from yesterday, dated 14th of November 2016, which I think was 3 days after the inspection. And at the first paragraph, it says you've received a debrief from HMIP, you've spoken to the board, and you agree that 2 things need to be said to HMIP or should be said. And the first point there is at the second paragraph down. You say, first, the IMB finds Brook House to be a well-run establishment, aiming to improve and with a remarkable attitude of care to the detainees from the staff. It is a shame, therefore, that this was not seen to rise above the reasonably good in any of the categories. As recognition for effort and a spur to the rest of the estate, I'm sure your team must have given serious consideration to the matter, but I felt it worth sharing this thought with you. So you're in this email telling HMIP that you think they should give Brook House a better review to some extent.
I don't think I'm quite saying that.
I'm
I'm raising the question as a point of information, really. I mean, what would make Brook House better is an implicit question that we were putting at this point.
So your interpretation of this now is not that you were saying that this report, it's a shame that it doesn't rise above reasonably good, but you want to know how it can in the future.
But both things. I mean, there was certainly no intention to press HMRP to change its rating.
What's the purpose of it then?
As what you've just said, that it was an interesting question why we saw it as better than they did.
And you've talked just now about drained staff that you were aware of and low staffing levels, for example, and you were aware...
That was 2017,
you
so
were
that was
aware,
after.
Sorry, you were aware in 2016, though, weren't you, of the introduction of new beds that you said had caused you concern?
Yes. Yes.
So your email here is based on your view of Brook House in November 2016, so 5 months before filming started for Panorama. Knowing what you do know now, do you still think that Brook House was a well-run establishment with a remarkable attitude of care to detainees?
No.
Even if that was, in fairness, your view at the time, do you agree now, thinking about it, that it was inappropriate to write to HMIP to suggest that to ask them about why they've given only reasonably good and not better scores?
On my interpretation of what we were attempting there, I would say no. I think things have changed. I think we would now be much more careful about our language.
It's not in the interest of detainees, is it, for you to write to HMIP and make suggestions or comments about their scoring being a bit harsh?
As a point of information, I think it would be useful, and in fact, the reply we had was very helpful. It was a very good reply, I thought.
The second point you make is a more detailed one, but along the same vein about educational provision, which is made. And if we do go to the bottom of page 1, we do see the response that you just referred to an hour later. I won't read it in full, but he points out that he agrees that the teacher was doing a great job, but he mentions that in our scoring system, a 4 indicates that we had no significant concerns, and in fact there were important issues in every area we felt prevented 4s. For example, safety, he mentions that the length of detention was high, security procedures were overzealous, detainees got locked up at 9, for example, strip searching without adequate justification, respect, ventilation and environment were relatively poor, there were issues in healthcare, activities were just adequate, further to be challenged by new beds, half of detainees saying they had too little to do, and preparation for release and removal was weak. These are things that you would have been aware of, aren't they?
Yes, yes.
So did you appreciate when you read this, oh, well, it's obvious why they haven't given...
Yeah, well, yes, it was very helpful.
4.
Very helpful.
I want to turn now to some examples of how complaints or concerns would work through the system during the relevant period. So the first example will involve D638. And you discuss this in your statement at page 27, paragraphs 83 to 84. If we first look at the Rotor report, it's IMB 000093. You have it also at tab 3. And this, as we will see, is the Rotor for your statutory visit in the week commencing 13th of February 2017. So top of page 2, please. And what we see in these reports is a wing-by-wing commentary, and then there's other facilities and matters considered towards the end. So if we look under Clyde Wing, so C Wing, and you mention there from the second line, I was approached by a D638, unhappy with treatment when he had been very poorly on the preceding Friday. He had felt too ill to leave his room, and his roommate had been to ask help on several occasions from the officers. He claimed he had been told that we don't do room service when the roommate had asked for medicine, I presume he meant paracetamol, and that he would have to get himself to healthcare to see the nurse. It did not sound too good, and I pointed him in the direction of the complaint forms if he wanted to take it further. So this is an account of a detainee who's unwell. He said he'd been too ill to leave his room. The roommate had asked for help several times, and help was refused in quite a rude way, if that's correct. That's quite a serious issue that's been raised with you, isn't it?
Yes.
He obviously wants you to do something because he's approached you. Nothing has been resolved just by the act of telling you. Something more needs to be done. You don't attain from him, from this report, the name of the officers who said they refused to help him. No. Do you think you should have done?
I don't think he would have known, because this was several days before, it was they didn't refer to officers by name.
Do you remember if you asked?
It would have been possible to find out who it was. The G4S would have been able to find out.
Would you have been able to find out?
By going to G4S, yes.
The thing you do here, according to your account, is tell him he can complete a form. You point him in the direction of the complaint forms. Is that a form to complain to G4S, or a form to write it down to complain to IMB?
What I was suggesting here was that he put in a complaint to the Home Office, and complaints to the Home Office are dealt with in different ways. There is a procedure for complaints. But some of them would end up going straight back to the G4S, and more serious ones would have gone to the PSU first.
Do you know if he could read and write English?
I seem to remember he was with another man, that between the two of them, his roommate, between the two of them, they would have been able to write.
He doesn't need to fill in a form for you to be able to take forward this issue.
This isn't the end of this isn't all the matter, though, is it?
Yes. You can raise it at a later date. And you're saying a statement at paragraph 84 that you suggested he write a form because it would strengthen his complaint, but that this was belt and braces because you also intended to raise it on his behalf.
Correct.
Which we see from the minutes of the next meeting. So if we look up IMB 000015, and this is the meeting that was held on the 15th of March 2017, so I think the next monthly meeting after it happened. Page 1 under item 5. Oh, sorry, no, it must be page 2. Yes, thank you. So JC week of 13.2, which is the week we just looked at. You mentioned induction records are not always completed, members to monitor, and then concerns over the treatment of detainees when they are not well enough to get out of bed. A detainee had complained he was told he had to attend healthcare in person, and an officer was unhelpful. Is this you raising it on his behalf?
Yes, because it would already have been seen. If I'm right on the timeline, I saw him, and then the board meeting was the next week, so my report would have gone to G4S and the Home Office on the Monday morning. And I think the board meeting was a couple of days later. So it was quite close. The whole thing was quite close.
I don't think so, because this is...
Am I wrong?
This is the minutes from a meeting on the 15th of March 2017.
And the application...
it was the week commencing 13th of February.
Okay, no, so it was a longer
this.
time. I'm asking you because I don't know, but it is possible that, or probable that I did an application form as well for this man.
Well, you don't mention it in your statement, and I don't believe that we've seen one.
Okay.
Let's proceed on the basis that this is the only thing, but if we find one, obviously we'll correct that. You haven't recorded here, which is your meeting with the Home Office and G4S present, the name of the detainee, but it would have been in your report.
Yes.
There's nothing in this summary about the fact that the roommate asked for help and medicine several times and was ignored.
This is a summary, of course.
And that an officer was unhelpful, and you say, sorry, an officer was unhelpful. Saying we don't do room service is a bit more than unhelpful when someone asks for medical attention, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it is a summary, and it's quite likely something that I would have brought up at the pre-board anyway with the director. But for the purpose of the minutes, we're dealing with summaries, but they would have had, the Home Office and G4S would have had the Rotor report in front of them as well.
But that doesn't require them to take action, does it, reading something on a Rotor report?
They did take action
What
on
did
the
they-
basis of our Rotor reports.
In this instance or generally?
I can't say in this instance, because we didn't really find out what happened about disciplinary. Well, we didn't find out about disciplinary matters.
Why not?
I think it was considered a confidential part of G4S.
Is it relevant to the IMB to find out whether detainees' complaints have been upheld or not?
No, that's not the same thing. Now I'm talking about the disciplinary process against the officer. That's a difficult one. I can't think. I can't. Can you ask me again?
Yes, no, of
Yeah.
course. So if let's say, for example, this person had made a complaint and the officer had been identified, just using this as an example, that's not necessarily what happened. The officer's identified and it's looked into as to whether they used this language or not and were unhelpful or not. Do you get to find the result
No.
of that?
No, not if it's, or at least I don't think we ever heard about the result of any disciplinary matter.
That's relevant to the IMB though, isn't it? If it's being found that officers are found to have been abusive or unhelpful to detainees?
We took it that we weren't told about. It was a confidential matter.
Do you, with the benefit of hindsight, think that it would have been useful to have pressed harder
It's
for
an
that?
interesting question. Obviously, it would deserve consideration. Yes, I mean our job was to report, and yes, I suppose our job is also to ensure that the reporting has resulted in action.
Otherwise, you're speaking to an empty room potentially, aren't you? Because you don't know what happens. And it's not just potentially relevant to hear whether complaints are upheld, but it's also potentially relevant, would you agree, to hear about the complaints which aren't upheld?
Yes.
So to hear,
I mean, we the PSU ones we did hear,
but not disciplinary.
but not no.
So we're discussing their monthly meeting. Now, this is in your statement, but to be clear, this would be a meeting between. We don't need these anymore. Thank you. A monthly meeting would be between people from the Home Office, G4S, and the IMB. Is that right?
Yes.
They were the three bodies that would attend those meetings.
Yes.
Generally.
Yes.
And in general terms, from G4S, we see, and I've had a look through them, it's frequently Steve Skitt who attends.
Well, I would have said overall it was more often Ben Saunders.
Ben Saunders. And also occasionally Jules Williams seems to be on there.
Well,
from
that was
time
just
to
a
time.
one-off when
Just once.
nobody. I mean, he wouldn't normally have been there because he wasn't one of the top group of managers. Michelle Brown attended at least once, but it was almost always one of the two.
Ben Saunders or
Ben
Steve Skitt.
or Steve Skitt, yes.
And we see various people from the Home Office. It seems to be often Paul Gasson or Michelle Smith.
It was almost always Paul Gasson
Right.
if he was around. The Ian Castle came sometimes. Michelle Smith came occasionally, and one of the two people below Paul Gasson, the deputy managers. So that would have been Simon or somebody else whose
Rob
name
Gibson?
I can't remember.
Rob Gibson.
Not in my time.
Okay.
Not in my time. Now I'm thinking back.
Fine.
Hina Patel would have been there.
I see. And I think she sometimes takes the minutes as well, doesn't she?
Yeah, well, that was their role in the meeting, yes.
So I think they're also referred to, or there's a reference somewhere to IMB clerks taking minutes. Who are they?
That they were, as part of the SLA, the Home Office had to provide a clerk, and it was one of the two deputy managers who took that role.
So it's somebody who already works at Brook House for the Home Office
For
and
the Home
steps
Office,
into
yes.
the...
Yes.
Were the whole meetings minuted or just some parts of them?
The whole meetings were minuted, but only the Home Office clerk was only there for a part of the meeting, so I would complete the rest.
I see. And one of the things that you discuss at these minutes are the combined reports. Perhaps we can look at one briefly because they contain quite a lot of useful information. If we look at the first one from the relevant period, it's IMB 000021. And this has been referred to for other witnesses, but for example, we see at page 1, there's various population data, which includes occupancy, number of new ACDTs and the total number, instances of use of force and whether or not they're planned, and the number of detainees subject to Rule 40 and 42 on page 2. At 1.18 there we have the number of acts of self-harm, which was there 21 by 15 individuals, and how many required treatment and where that was done, number of complaints and their status, and 1.19, number of complaints against G4S. Are these the complaints that we were just discussing that you wouldn't see the outcome of, but you might see the number of them?
Yes.
Page 3, 2.4, is not redacted, it's just very dark blue highlighting for some reason, but it says number of Rule 35 reports received, and it says 9 released, 22 detention maintained. So 32 Rule 35s resulting in 9 releases, and then there's a list there of the longest serving detainees, the top being someone who'd been at Brook House by the looks of it for about a year and a half. And on the following page, we see D687, who we've heard about in this inquiry already. And then there's another similar table. So every month, the same types of information would be captured, wouldn't they? Although obviously the data changes. Did you or did anyone else do a sort of rolling analysis of this? So looking at peaks and troughs in different data?
Particularly for our own areas, I would do it overall at the end of the year for the annual report. But
Yep.
We were interested. We asked the Home Office about why certain people were being detained for such a long time. We would raise sudden increases or patterns in the use of force and the Rule 40s.
And how would you identify such increases? Did you put them in a Excel spreadsheet, for example?
Well, I'd be looking back over past ones.
Yep.
It tended to be me that actually asked the questions in the board meeting, so I would have looked back and I would say, well, that's a bit odd, or rather, can you explain why there's a sudden increase this month?
So you've got all of the previous monthly reports and you're
yes.
looking through them. I see. Turning then to how more general concerns are raised through Rotor reports and also these meetings. If we look at IMB 00051, please. And if we go to page 2 of this, now what you're about to see is a Rotor visit report by Miss Markwick for the week commencing 24th of April, so again at the start of the relevant period. And under the heading there, healthcare, she writes, concerned that the workload is very high and one of the doctor's attendances will be reduced by the opening of Tinsley. Chrissy says they are barely coping. I assume that's Chrissy Williams. There is an increase of abuse to doctors. And you discuss this in your statement at pages 28 to 29. You say at 88 you were abroad for most of this month, but you were aware of these problems. And you say, then, the IMB were informed that we could not see the contract between the Home Office and G4S as it was commercially sensitive. In that sense, the IMB had limited power to monitor contractual issues. What's that got to do with the healthcare concerns about high workloads?
I wasn't particularly aware that I was answering that particular aspect, because that would be the staffing of the nurse staffing, so it would be something I would go to Sandra Calver about.
At page 23, paragraph 66, with reference to healthcare staff, that you said that there was problems with staffing and that Brook House was a difficult and stressful place to work with not very few good outcomes for the people in the care of the staff. What do you mean by not very good outcomes?
Well, it was the question of removal.
So the outcome is probably going to be removal, and that's not a good outcome. I see. So Miss Markwick had noted this issue with healthcare that we just saw. And if we look then at IMB 000009, this is a report dated 7th of July, although it seems to be about a Rotor visit from the 3rd of May by Louise Gledhill. So it's a week or so after Miss Markwick's comments, and healthcare again is at page 2. She notes that she visited healthcare and spoke to one of the nurses. Sorry, it might be bottom of page 2, yeah. Nurses have been very busy. Extra number of detainees. Now the new beds are filled means they're a lot busier, and last week they had 100 arrivals over 2 days, so it was impossible to carry out all the initial healthcare interviews within a suitable timescale. And then on page 5, which we don't need to go to, it's noted as 100 arrivals in 2 days. How is this managed? Again, I won't turn it up, but Mr. Weber, I think you pronounced it, visited on the 10th and 11th of May 2017. And he again repeats those pressures and again raises it as an action point. He says, I had a long conversation with Michael Wells, Healthcare. He reported that the additional 60 spaces had created new pressures, 100 new detainees had been received, increase in the waiting time for GP appointments, so that additional resources could be allocated to reception. And the next meeting is on the 17th of May 2017, and Mr Gasson and Mr Skitter there from the G4S and the Home Office respectively. And it's on page 3 of that report. Again, I won't turn it up, but I'll read it to you. Miss Gledhill's report is mentioned, but not the comments that she made about healthcare or the action point. Mr Weber is attending, and the entry is Dick WC, that's his first name, 8th of the 5th, raised about the lack of IMB forms on the wings, dealt with earlier. DW asked if any impact had been noticed from the increase in population. SS had not been made aware of any issues. SS is Steve Skitt. That seems to be all that's said on it. The minutes don't suggest that there was a discussion about the waiting time for GP appointments, the impossibility of doing initial assessments. It just says that Mr Webber had asked if any impact had been noted, and Steve Skitt had said he's not aware.
I'm not sure whether this is the point, but there are two separate issues here. The 100 people arriving was a completely one-off event, which related to one of the centres closing. It might have been Dover, it might have been the Verne, but it was a sort of an overnight, from Brook House point of view, an overnight thing. So there were 100 people arrived unexpectedly, queuing up in coaches outside, which was obviously going to totally tax the system in reception. That was dealt with, and some of those assessments would have been late. But the general problem was the increase in capacity and the loss of the Tinsley staff, including nurse and doctors. And that was putting pressure on the system, but it hadn't actually got to an impossible degree. People were saying it was busy. So Steve Skitt was saying it was busy, but he hadn't had any, presumably, notification of anything major as yet. And there was a problem. There was a period when healthcare was having significant problems recruiting staff, I remember.
So there's the mention about the specific arrival over 2 days. There's obviously going to be a knock-on effect, isn't there? People having late assessments will be processed through the system more slowly or with a delay.
And at that particular moment, yes, there would have been.
And it's not just the day they arrive that the issue, because the 100 people remain there and the capacity remains high.
Yes, I think it was probably tied in with people moving back to Tinsley, so there was more capacity. But certainly an explosion of 100 people would make a significant difference.
And the way it's dealt with, it seems, is DW asking if any impact had been noticed and SS not being made aware of any issues. Do you think, with the benefit of hindsight, that the discussion could have been rather, have you noticed any difference?
Well,
No.
I think there probably was more of a discussion.
Just not recorded in the minutes.
But it wouldn't have been recorded, yes.
Can we talk now about D1914, a detainee we've heard about on a number of occasions? I just want to ask about the process for when a situation like his arose. So we have in a report which is at IMB 000013. This is Miss Markwick's report, not yours. Rotor visits on the 3rd and 7th of July 2017. At the top, under general comments, she said that the week started quietly, but then a number of things happened on the Wednesday. That was the 5th of July, so not maybe one of the days she was there. And at 20 o'clock, you see the big kind of gap there in the last hour, and the last entry under that indented bit, Mr. D1914 OD'd on heart meds, cut neck, and both wrists, currently in hospital. Just help us generally, what should an IMB member who becomes aware of an event like this do, if anything?
Well, at this point, we would note it. She would note it in her notebook, and then when she went into this, when we would go into the centre, we would see whether this gentleman. Well, he was in hospital, so that wouldn't have been anything that we could have done anything about. But when he came back, she would have picked him up in E-Wing or CSU or wherever. Presumably he would have been on an ACDT, so she would have read the ACDT documents.
And if for example, he gets discharged after her rota week is over, how does the next IMB member know to go and visit him?
Well, again, he would either be on Rule 40, in CSU, in E-wing, and if he was on a wing, his ACDT would be open. And we checked all the ACDTs.
And is this something that potentially could be escalated and discussed at a meeting? So we've had a pretty serious self-harm event, or would you expect this to be dealt with just by the system you discussed?
Probably by the system. I mean, I remember this gentleman. I remember seeing him lying there because I've had heart bypasses, so I felt a certain sympathy for him. But it was just dealt with in the usual way.
I want to ask next about D1527, somebody who appears on the Panorama documentary. And if we turn up IMB 000036, please. This is your Rotor report for the week commencing 22nd of May 2017. And at page 2, we'll see the reference to him. D1527, I won't read it in full, but it's noted he's been on ACDT since it was opened in prison. He's been on C-Wing, wants to kill himself. Not eating from the servery, but you mentioned he's bought peanuts. Healthcare are not concerned with his health at the moment, but Healthcare, Home Office et al. Want to prevent things deteriorating. And you note there, he's refusing to engage with nurses, and the Home Office is intending to ask him if he wants to sign a life directive. If he refuses, which is likely, then treatment can be given if it becomes necessary. One to keep our eye on, two, and then the next sentence is about showers and laundry. So on the 5th of May 2017, you may have heard discussion in the inquiry now. D1527 got on the netting holding a piece of broken plate to his neck. I won't turn it up unless you need to see it, but a Rule 40 report followed that event, as did a use of force with a form. And I understand the IMB are informed every time either of those events happen. Indeed, both forms do record that the IMB had been informed Miss Gledhill on that occasion. And they would have also been informed of the Rule 40, which had been used on the 25th of April. How would the IMB, in your words, seek to keep an eye on vulnerable detainees? Is it the same process that you described with D1914 just now?
Things happened afterwards, but in looking at what I said at that point, what I was saying to the next Rotor person was, this is somebody that we need to keep an eye on, because his name would have been there, obviously. And so I would have expected the Rotor person the next week to look out for him and see how things were evolving.
If a detainee, such as 1527, we now know what happened to him while he was in detention, doesn't raise a complaint with the IMB, isn't willing to, doesn't know how to, whatever, what steps can you take to support or assist or monitor him? Is it just kind of discussing amongst yourself, keep an eye on him? Can you proactively go to somebody and ask them what's going on, encourage them to come?
Well, certainly we can. I mean, there were the best part of 500 people there, so we'd need some kind of heads up on a particular case. If it wasn't a complaint, or if it wasn't an officer saying, Mr. So-and-so is a bit worried, could you have a word with him, which happened. The question is how you pick up something like that.
Is there, well, it's been picked up here, hasn't it? To a certain extent.
Yes, absolutely.
Is there potentially a better way of flagging it, rather than assuming someone will read quite a lot of text and think I need to take action, maybe recording it in a separate document, a handover?
Sometimes I would do that. Sometimes, well, our regular practice was at the end of a week to send the report out and phone the person that was taking over from us and discussing with them people of concern that we'd like followed up. I might well have done that on this occasion.
But it wouldn't have been written in the report?
It wouldn't have been written in the report, no, because it would have been subsequent.
I want to ask next about Rule 35, so that can be removed from the screen, thank you. So in the annual report 2016, I won't read it all out, but you mention Rule 35 assessments for torture, etc. And just to summarise it, it's noted that monitoring Rule 35 is of interest to the IMB. And then you go on at the next paragraph to discuss some limitations in that monitoring. You mentioned that there's an average of 14 reports done per month in 2016, healthcare having 12 slots per week for Rule 35 appointments. And the final sentence records that it's surprising that there are so few reports by GPs about detainees whose health is likely to be affected by continuing detention or suspecting that a detainee has suicidal intentions, given that reporting from G4S showed an average of 11 incidents of self-harm attempts per month in 2016. So we know you know about the number of incidents of self-harm. We've seen the combined reports, and you've recorded here, I know it would have been done with the whole board, but it's your report as the chair. It's surprising there's so few Rule 35, I suppose, 1 and 2 reports. Did you get a response from G4S or the Home Office to your record of surprise at the low number of Rule 35 reports here?
No, I remember Mary was trying to find a breakdown, and the Home Office said that wasn't possible. I don't think it was to be difficult. I think it was just that the way they kept their figures, that it would have been difficult, or they said it was difficult for them, because that would have given us the breakdown into the 1, 2, 3s. Sorry, I've forgotten your question.
No, that's fine. You said you don't think they were trying to be difficult by refusing to give a breakdown.
Yeah. I don't think they were deliberately hiding information.
But it's information you're entitled to see, subject to the confidentiality
yes,
requirements,
absolutely.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Knowing that it's just, there's 3 different forms, one's a Rule 35.1, one's a Rule 35.2, and one's a Rule 35.3, with the benefit of hindsight, it's actually quite easy, isn't it, to just tot up which of each one?
Yes, yeah.
Could you have probed a bit more into whether that breakdown could have been provided?
I think, now looking back, yes, absolutely.
So you say that there's a low number, though, of the first 2 types. How did you know that if you didn't get the breakdown? Was it...
Well, Mary was the one that was heading up on this. It was her special interest, and so she'd be better able. I think the answer is I don't know. She will.
Well, hopefully we'll hear from her soon, so I'll ask her about it. We now know that there continued during 2017 to be a very low number of Rule 35.1 reports and indeed no Rule 35.2 reports, but this isn't mentioned again in the 2017 IMB report, so the same sort of point isn't made. Do you know why that wasn't raised again?
No.
You do state in your statement at paragraph 44 and 94 to 95 that the IMB raised concerns with the Home Office, though, about Rule 35 generally. Do you remember what concerns during that period were raised with the Home Office, other than asking for the disaggregated data?
There was the question about training for doctors. There was a question about how many were successful. How many? The general discussion. There was more discussion at the healthcare meetings, and I was able to pick up some information there. What we were able to monitor relatively easily was on the whiteboard in the Home Office, where they would follow through the procedure to make sure it was the 24 hours and the 48 hours and so on, that the right things were happening, and that's where we picked up several occasions when they certainly weren't.
Oh, so you could see from that the fact of a report, the time frame, but obviously not the content of the report.
Yeah, exactly, yes.
And you say that you were aware of the training for doctors issue.
Yes.
How did you become aware of that?
Well, mainly through the healthcare forums.
And they were forums that you attended as a...
I attended as that was my special interest, yes.
And one example that you gave at paragraph 95, the last thing you raised in that paragraph, is a concern raised by Miss Molyneux that a caseworker had asked for more information about Rule 35 issues, thereby stalling the process. And you say that this and other cases were raised at the IRE forum?
The Chairs Forum.
Okay, same thing as the Chairs Forum. And you say it was passed back by Alan Gibson for Paul Gasson to investigate and answer locally, which you say he did at the May board meeting. And we see the May meeting notes, and they say, Rule 35 report, Mary Molyneux, was concerned by the recent caseworker's response to a Rule 35 report and not sure if the Home Office had actioned this request in a timely manner. Action. PG advised that he had looked into this report and HP, Hina Patel, had ensured that the processes were in order. Closed. It's not much of a detailed answer as to what happened, is it?
Not recorded. There would have been more discussion, obviously. That wouldn't have been... There would have been the board would need to understand what was being discussed there, so there would have been more.
And be content that the processes had been properly followed.
Yes, there would have been an explanation.
Why wasn't that recorded in the minutes?
I can't answer that.
I want to ask now about IMB's more direct involvement with Rule 35, which you mention at page 31, paragraph 92. And you say that if an IMB member identified a potential torture victim, we would go to healthcare and discuss the case with medical staff. I presume for the same confidentiality reasons you couldn't directly monitor what happened next and what's written in the report. Right. But what if a IMB member had concerns about a Rule 35 1 or 2 issue, so a likelihood of being injuriously affected by detention or suspicion of suicidal intentions? Would that be the same? Could you report it and refer to healthcare?
Well, we would go to healthcare and talk through cases that were of concern to us.
You didn't know, from what I understand, because you weren't given the data, that no Rule 35-2 reports and only a very few Rule 35-1 reports were being done, even when it seems, as you say in the 2016 report, that people probably met that criteria because you say there was so many open ACDTs and the volume of self-harm was quite high. Yes. And indeed, various healthcare witnesses to the inquiry have accepted the same. Is it correct to say then that the Rule 35 wasn't working as an effective safeguard during the relevant period?
Correct.
And was part of that either due to or at least not addressed by the IMB?
We could have done better.
What in particular do you think you could have done better?
Insisting on better, or finding a way to obtain more precise indications.
And would you accept that those problems still persisted by the time you left the IMB?
I can't remember. I mean, I presume so. I can't remember.
You don't remember being provided then with the number of?
I can't remember. And I would by that time, as an ordinary member, I would have dealt with detained people who were presenting to me with problems,
rather than
and I would have dealt with that, but rather than policy.
Another one I'll ask Ms Molyneux about. Thank you. Rule 40 then, briefly, you cover this in your statement at pages 33 to 35, and you've already helped us with the fact that the IMB's informed of each use of Rule 40. That's a requirement by Rule 40 subsection 5 to be informed without delay. You say if you were present, you'd attend, and if you weren't present, you'd be contacted. Is that right? But either way, you should be informed. Yes. Do you know, it might be impossible to know, whether you were always duly informed of Rule 40 being used?
We found very, very, very few instances when we hadn't been. But the way we found out was indirect, very often indirect, obviously. So we would go into the Oscars office when we first arrived and look at the board to see who was on Rule 40. We would go into E-Wing and ask who was on Rule 40 and see them. So we would have ways of comparing the two facts. And
if you did find an example of, you say very, very few, but an example of when you hadn't been duly informed, what action
that
would you take?
That would have been raised with management.
Would you require them to do anything or just tell them?
Well, they implicitly they had to let us know. They were obliged to let us know. So.
And they haven't. In those examples.
And then, so we would raise it, and they would say, "Terribly, terribly sorry. Make sure it'll happen," as they did on other areas where they'd been a bit slack.
What sort of checks, if any, would you do on the use of Rule 40? So individually, did you look at the decision to satisfy yourself that it was appropriate to use Rule 40?
No.
Why not?
I don't think it had occurred to us.
Why did you?
We didn't really know very much at that stage about how to look at use of force.
Rule 40, sorry, is the removal from association.
I'm conflating the two.
No, it's fine. But you were informed about both of them in similar ways, weren't you? Yeah. And your name appears on the front cover of either a Rule 40 or a use of force report when you're informed of them.
Yeah.
And is it the same answer for both, use of force and Rule 40, that you would be notified, but you wouldn't look into the decision to use?
We wouldn't look into the decision.
Or Rule 40?
No. We would ideally see the person.
Yeah.
And there was an opportunity there for them to tell us things, but no, we didn't check that out.
Why did you think the IMB was required to know that say, Rule 40 had been used against somebody, just to give you an opportunity to go and speak to that person?
Well, I think we were focusing on the experience, so which we'd pick up from hopefully from the individual, rather than on what had happened before on the decision making.
It might be the case, mightn't it, that Rule 40 is used on somebody who is removed from the centre before the next visit even occurs,
Indeed.
and then you never speak to them.
Absolutely, or they might be back on the wing. Cause,
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or released into the community.
Yeah.
And then you never speak to them, and all that's done is IMB are told that it's happened.
I mean, sometimes, of course, we were actually involved in the Rule 40 procedure, because we'd be in the centre at the time, so we would have an opportunity at that point to see the decision making. We'd be in on the whatever you call it, the discussion beforehand, when the
briefing, or
what's it called?
is it briefing before use of force
thank you.
sometimes?
Yes.
Yeah. But you wouldn't, even when you were there in person, tell me if I'm wrong, go behind that decision and look into the rationale of using force? Or...
Well, we would hear. I mean, there was that occasion with the gentleman who was that the doctors had said was fit to fly.
D1914.
Yeah, well, and so we would have been aware of that at that particular point, but it certainly wasn't. It wasn't done thoroughly, shall we say, by the IMB.
Did you ever, or did anyone from your knowledge ever from the IMB challenge a decision to use force or invoke Rule 40?
Not in my knowledge.
And as to individuals held on Rule 40...
Well, can I just...
Sorry, yeah, please.
There was
do.
an exception, of course, when Dick picked up that somebody was on Rule 40 and an ACDT, so there was an occasion when we questioned why a man was on Rule 40.
So this is discussed at 108 and 109 of your statement. It's D2177, I understand. So he was placed on Rule 40 in constant watch after attempting to self-ligature. He was placed on Rule 40 in E-Wing on ACDT, and you raised this with Mr. Skitter, Mr. Gasson, because, as you say in your statement, your view was that vulnerable persons on ACDT shouldn't be on a Rule 40, and Mr. Weber says the same in his report, which you read in quoting a witness statement. He said, "I am somewhat concerned that a detainee who has been attempting to self-harm should be placed on Rule 40 because he had resisted the attempts of staff to restrain him." And you say there you were told that Rule 40 was imposed as a technicality to keep him under observation, and you say you found this a reasonable explanation. So your understanding was that it was potentially appropriate to use Rule 40 as a
Yes,
technicality.
I think it was for a very short period, probably to give them a bit of a breath to work out what to do next. And I think it was actually Dick rather than me, but I might be wrong there. But yes.
As to the general requirements of Rule 40, and you mentioned the handbook, you say at paragraph 103 on page 34, IMB Handbook for IMB members in IRCs, updated October 2016, states that IMB visitors must visit within 24 hours any detainee who's removed from association, Rule 40, or placed in temporary confinement. Now, you mentioned the handbook, but it's also part of the detention centre rules. And you say this wasn't done at Brook House. And was that because there weren't enough people to visit everybody?
There weren't enough visits.
Not enough visits. And you say that the handbook mentions that if this can't be done, dispensation can be requested, but you don't think that that was done either. So you seem to know that this was the rule because at High Down it was complied with.
Yes, at High Down it had been one particular time of one particular day in the week when all the reviews would be done. And of course they had three IMB members on every week, whereas Brook House, things could kick off at any time of day or night.
And so the requirement wasn't complied with. There was no dispensation. Is it that you inherited the practice?
Well, one, I inherited it. Two, I checked with the National Council rep at the time. Three, the National Council rep, when I questioned her later on, she was actually involved in deciding the budget and the number of visits we could make. So she was well aware of the situation. And the Home Office was aware. Everybody knew that we couldn't possibly go in for every review. Because
of the reasons you've explained, there was a limit on the number of visits.
Yes.
And we've already discussed the example of 2177, who we said was placed on Rule 40, it's described as a technicality. And there's just another example, which I can bring up on screen, IMB 000036, page 3 of that, please, and it's under the subheading security. Now, this is your statutory visit in the week commencing 22nd of May, and it says under security that you fielded concerns from a task or agent over a detainee who had been recently removed, who had been kept in CSU on Rule 40 for several days, despite being mentally unwell. And you say that you're assured by security that he was on Rule 40 for his own protection. So again, as we already saw with the on Rule 40 as a technicality to keep an eye on someone, you accepted assurances from the Home Office or from G4S that segregation was justified for protective purposes. Did you ever take any steps to see whether that was a legitimate use of Rule 40?
I'm not quite sure about that question, but the Home Office had to sign it off, and the healthcare and G4S would have been at the reviews each day when this was discussed as to what to do, how best to manage this person with his particular problems. So we accepted the decision in the short term until a better solution could be found.
To use Rule 40? Accepted that decision?
Yeah, I mean, there is a real problem there of what to do with somebody if he's not safe to go back onto the wings, and he's not safe to mix with people on E-wing. If it was a mental health issue, what he needed was a bed, and healthcare would have been working on this to try to get a mental health bed for him as soon as possible.
It's said in the 2017 Imb report in relation to Rule 40, firstly, that there was no evidence that it was being used indiscriminately or inappropriately, and also that it was reserved for occasions on which detainees had behaved in a clearly unacceptable way. That's not...
And this is an exception to that rule, absolutely.
So it's not completely correct if it's sometimes used for people who are at risk.
But it has to be said very occasionally.
But that's not qualified in the report.
No, correct.
On now to use of force. So you discuss your training and knowledge of use of force during the relevant period. And you say there was no IMB training on use of force, but you attended a defensive technique course by John Connolly and his team. Is this focused on protecting yourself?
Yes, it made you aware of issues, of course, but it wasn't. It didn't teach us how it taught us protective holds, but it didn't really fit us for watching an incident.
Yes, and you mentioned being at Brook House on the 17th of May 2017 when you attended a planned training session on adults at risk, and it was the time when D275 accessed the netting. We saw footage of this on Panorama. And you say Mrs. Gajatsi went to D-Wing to monitor and you watched from the control room. And you say this was a serious incident. However, I had no particular concerns at this stage. We were observing over and above the concerns I would have at any serious incident. Like many other serious incidents we had monitored, it needed resolution as soon as possible, and that was in everyone's interest. D275 must have been very uncomfortable, and other detained persons were unable to enjoy normal evening association. So D275 had a history of self-harm. He'd been on ACDT for a few weeks from January to the 3rd of February after self-harming. He'd also self-harmed twice while on Rule 40. Including by cutting his stomach with a broken mirror. And when he was on the netting in this occasion, he had 2 razor blades, one in his hand and one in his mouth. Do you know if you were aware when you were watching it that you were aware of that history and also of the present issue?
Not during the board meeting when we had the monitors on, but as soon as the command suites open, all this information is produced. So people run around and get files, and there's a nurse in attendance discussing exactly what his issues are. There's a great discussion going on, and that's the whole point of the command suite being open.
And you say you had no particular concerns over and above any serious incident. Is that still the case when you learnt that information?
Well, no, I mean, when I say no concern, it was a serious incident by definition, and therefore it's not that nobody cared about it, it's that I was watching it and it was progressing correctly.
He was removed by force to the CSU, and I think you saw him there because he'd also been pepper sprayed, hadn't he?
Yeah.
So your assessment that it was progressing correctly, you might accept, wouldn't have involved an assessment of whether force was used correctly on him, because you say you hadn't had training in the correct use of force.
Yes, I mean, use of the way it was handled by the Nationals, which is the use of force. Well, it was very, very interesting, actually, the way they used a rope to walk him back towards that wall and helped him over. So, I mean, use of force. It wasn't like some of the uses of forces that I've seen. Sorry, what was your question?
You don't have any training on what kind of force is proportionate, or what kind of forces techniques are used in particular circumstances? Are you obviously?
No. We had no training. We were watching the screen, and there was staff were commenting on what they were seeing on the screen.
Yep.
We couldn't be near at that point because of the pepper spray.
Yep. And so when you assess force as being, when you make any assessment of the use of force, it's not based on.
Yes.
Then there's another incident which you record in IMB 00036, which I only have another to pause, Chair, another 10 minutes or so for this witness. So it might make sense to finish her and then go to the break rather than pause and come back, if that's okay.
Thank you, that's fine.
Thank you. So this is 00036, another incident. And it's your report for the week commencing 22nd of May 2017. Page 1 under phone calls. So this is you receiving phone calls when you're on call, I think, and D812 there, 23rd of the 5th. D812 was being moved as part of a planned removal at 0035, but had a weapon and threatened to take his life. So he was moved with a fully kitted team and handcuffs. They had a weapon, threatening to take his life, and again, moved by force. That's what a fully kitted team is, isn't it? It's for a planned intervention to constant watch. And then you go and see him on page 2 on E-Wing. And his complaint there, you say, so it's back in the middle of the page there under Eden Wing. As above, I spoke to the CW, D812, who was up and about and very affable. His complaint was that he had been in detention for 19 months. He had applied for bail, but the address was not acceptable to the Home Office, and he wants a resolution to his case one way or another. So both of these incidents that we've just discussed, D275 and now D812, involve the use of force in circumstances where someone was attempting to harm themselves, don't they? And there's no record that you recorded any concerns other than recording your Rotor report that you spoke to them about the use of force on people who were attempting to self-harm. Can you help us with whether force was frequently used on people to prevent self-harm during the relevant period?
If you define use of force as putting your hands on somebody, then yes, it was always used, but it wouldn't necessarily have been a concern, because to cut a ligature off somebody or to take their hands off their neck we wouldn't consider untoward. There was the incident, and I can't remember whether this involved this gentleman, where somebody was had gone onto the netting and then was put on Rule 40 and taken down with a kitted team to the CSU. We weren't aware of it as it happened, as we saw it happening, and that would have caused concern.
We've talked about your analysis of use of force and the fact that you had no training against which to judge. And you also helped us with regard to Rule 40, that generally IMB wouldn't go behind the underlying decision to invoke Rule 40. Was that also the case with use of force? So the IMB wouldn't look into, was the use of force justified in this occasion? Did you see your role more of seeing the person afterwards?
If it came to our attention, we would. It would have to be brought to our attention in a specific case that we didn't think at the time that we would go out and get figures for this sort of thing.
So
No
when
question.
you're informed that force has been used, as you're required to be, you don't go and look at the underlying reasons for use of force being used, unless there's something else is flagged to you to give you concern.
Yes, well, yeah, I mean, we would obviously catch up with somebody on an ACDT in E-Wing, as I've said before, but we didn't at that time do a thorough investigation of it.
Was that because there wasn't time to do it, or you didn't know against what to judge
Learning
it?
process.
And you accept at page 60, that can go from the screen now, thank you. Page 63 of your statement at paragraph 186, discussing the 2017 annual report, that the section on use of force with its significant increase and in the occasions on which force was used should have rung loud alarm bells. You say, I believe the IMB's analysis is still good, but I would now be proposing further measures to improve our monitoring of this area in particular. So this is published after Panorama, the 2017 report, because it covered that year. So you knew then not only about the statistical increases in use of force shown in the data, but about the specific abuses that are shown on Panorama. So how come no loud alarm bells were ringing even then about the increased use of force?
What, at the time that we wrote the annual report?
Yeah.
I thought you just read that we were.
That's your reflection on the annual report now. It's a reflection in your witness statement made last year.
Well, I think
this year.
the question is what happened between seeing Panorama at the beginning of September and the report actually being written in January. And I think we were becoming far more aware. There was a lot of work being done on watching camera footage, etc., attending the scrutiny meetings.
And you say in that section, which I just read to you, I believe the IMB's analysis is still good, but you say you'd be proposing further measures. What do you mean by, I believe the IMB's analysis is still good?
I presume the analysis, this was a section written by Dick, and I thought it was a very thorough analysis of the patterns and trends. Doesn't mean that we were using it in the right way.
I see. You just mentioned use of force meetings, and your statement at 117 says that in the early years there was a monthly use of force meeting that IMB members could attend where CCTV could be reviewed and discussed. So in the early years, is that before Panorama?
Yes.
And you could attend, didn't always, and obviously again when the IMB did attend you weren't using it against a framework of understanding use of force in the level of detail you would have done if you'd have had a training like the
Well, I think the
officers
point
do.
what there was that by going to those meetings, you actually heard the experts talking, and that's where we picked up. That was one of our areas of training, if you like.
And the experts talking, by the experts you mean members of staff at G?
Members of staff from
Brook House?
security, from the coordinator, and so on. Listening to them, they would be saying such and such a DCO shouldn't have behaved in such and such a way, and yeah, it wasn't much more could be done on that for the IMB.
You don't think much more could have been done?
No. I think we could learn a lot more about how force is used. But then, of course, you've got to be close enough to see it. I mean, we could see it on the screen, and in that situation, we would usually have somebody over our shoulder pointing things out to us.
They would be, again, members of G4S staff?
Yes.
I may ask Miss Molyneux about how that's done now. At 117 and 118, you say that IMB were entitled to access footage, but you say that someone had to be there to facilitate it, and you discussed this being discussed in a meeting on the 18th of October 2017, so after Panorama. You say, in my chair's letter for that meeting, I passed on Michelle Brown's comment that it may take a couple of weeks for us to see the footage, as it takes time for them to do their analysis. And you say, I don't know what analysis was carried out or why it took time. Did you ask why can't we see the raw footage?
I can't remember the why this cropped up. It was because there was no question of permission, but we needed it facilitated. And I presume I just thought it was one of those technical issues.
So it might take a few weeks, and you understand that.
Well, of course, there was a shortage of staff to do whatever they had to do with it.
if an incident involving a detained person raises concerns, it's a bit late if you only
Yeah,
see...
of course, there's no reason why we shouldn't work. If a situation cropped up, then why wouldn't we just go and say, look, this is too urgent. You need to look at this now, because they could look at it now. They very often were looking at footage when we passed through the office. So I don't quite understand what I was saying here, because in not an emergency, but in a situation of need, we could override it.
Did you?
To my knowledge, other than the scrutiny meetings, if we're talking post-panorama, after the scrutiny meetings, apart from the scrutiny meetings, I remember Louis raising it as an issue of wanting to see it, and somebody else did as well. I don't know.
I want to ask last about your post-panorama reaction. So in your statement at 155 to 157, page 53, you discuss comments you made at a meeting with GDWG on the 14th of November 2017, after the broadcast, obviously. And the minutes were made by GDWG, but they record, IMB did not know about panorama issues raised. They felt that Panorama gave a distorted picture. In their IMBs, there were undoubtedly a couple of serious incidents captured, including the strangulation, but much of the programme was dramatic music, blurry images giving an impression of chaos, and fluff. And you say in your statement you regret the fluff comment.
It's a very evocative word, fluff. And other members of the board used the word padding, but it was trying to get to the nux of what we were actually seeing in that programme. So you exclude Callum running around blowing his whistle, for example, and just the general noise levels. We were trying to get down to what was really essential there. Of course, from this inquiry, I've seen far more than was ever included in that Panorama programme.
So now you appreciate, from what I understand from your answer, that it was more than just a couple of serious incidents that were recorded at the time, even if Panorama didn't show.
Yes, I mean, more that, I mean, I don't want to belittle what was in Panorama, but there's been so much more since.
And you said at the time that you were very angry with the BBC and Callum Tully, although you now appreciate a little more the editorial decisions which led to Mr Tully recording and then later sharing what he saw, which you hadn't appreciated fully at the time. Is that a summary? Although you maintain, had he chosen to share the information with me from previous experience and in view of the seriousness of the allegations, I would not have limited myself to G4S managers, but I would have gone to the upper levels of the IMB to seek advice urgently. So none of the concerning footage of Mr Callum Tully is him on his own, obviously. It's people doing and saying things freely in front of him and other officers, including healthcare staff. And none of them shared any information with you either, did they?
No.
With the benefit of hindsight, do you know why not?
Simply no. I mean, I know, as I've said, Callum Tully was in my ITC, and I'd gone through how we weren't there only for officers, but we worked with officers, and we would use their information. And I did have the the mobile phone number of Alan Gibson. So if anything like this had come to my attention, I think I would have gone straight to the top.
But it didn't.
But it absolutely not.
And
absolutely not.
With the ability to reflect on that, you say you still don't know why nobody told you.
Well, you can. I'm no longer in the field now, but there are things that could be done.
Can you help us with what your view, not as a current IMB member, but as someone who was there at the time, what could be done to make staff more open about?
Well, more staff, because the relaxed staff, when they did have a lot of officers around, were in a better frame of mind, better able to deal with problems. But it's trying to build their morale, their self-respect in their job, which is a big ask in an enterprise that is based on bottom lines.
That sounds helpfully like an answer of how to avoid these things happening in the first place. But what I also asked you about was how to ensure that in the future, if these things do happen, people are
we can see.
told.
Yeah.
Do you have any views on that?
I haven't come up with a good solution. No.
Again, I can ask Miss Molyneux if
Yes,
she's had any
absolutely.
views on that. And the last thing I want to ask about is monitoring the Home Office, which you cover in your statement, page 62, IMB 000204. So again, your statement, page 62, and it's at paragraph 183, under the heading Monitoring and Challenging the Home Office. This is following Panorama again, so page 62, thank you, and 183. You say, we reviewed our monitoring of the Home Office following Panorama and discussed it at meetings. At both meetings, it was felt that it could be useful to discuss arrangements with the Home Office. As a senior Home Office manager, Michelle Smith was invited to conduct a training session at one of our board meetings, during which we could discuss how the IMB could better monitor the Home Office. But I understand this didn't happen. So Senior Home Office Manager Miss Smith was going to conduct training on how to train on monitoring the Home Office. Does that sound a bit odd with the benefit of hindsight?
Well, there are a lot of areas of the Home Office that were closed to us. And so really the idea was, bearing in mind their concerns and our concerns, we could have investigated interesting avenues when we could help them, they could help us to do our to perform our roles better. It didn't happen because we had a full programme for the rest of that year while I was chair, and then it just died the death. It didn't seem to be important anymore. But it was a conversation I had with Michelle Smith about our roles that made it sound a good idea.
We've talked about what can be done in relation to staff being more willing to share concerns, and I think you'd accept that you need to take such concerns seriously if they are raised to you.
Yes.
I want to ask lastly about detainees sharing concerns and how that was responded to during the relevant period. So if we could turn up IMB 000013, please. And this is an IMB, I believe, Rotor report. It's your report from the week commencing July the 3rd.
Elizabeth.
Oh, sorry, it's Elizabeth's report, sorry. I do apologise. It's a report I've showed you already because we've discussed it in relation to 1914. And the first entry, the week started quietly. Wednesday, 5 p.m, Mr D68 had a hissy fit, damaged a wing office and tore up a load of complaint forms. He will be chatted with after supper with a view to returning him to the wing. Can you just help me with the appropriateness or otherwise of describing what happened here as a detainee having a hissy fit?
Not appropriate.
Is this something you, if you can recall, you noticed at the time when you read this report as you would have done as chair?
I can't remember having noticed it.
If you had noticed it, what might you have been able to do?
Well, I would probably have raised it in the open meeting and said, you know, we really do need to be careful about our use of language.
And it's not just the use of language that's recorded on the form, isn't it? It's you might accept that it speaks to the seriousness with which incidents are understood. Because if a hissy fit is the way that a visitor sees a detainee who's doing something like that, they might not take appropriate steps afterwards because it's minimising it, isn't it?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think Elizabeth would have minimised in this situation. I think it's just one of those evocative words which you have to be careful about.
I don't have any further questions for you, Ms Colbrand. The chair may, however.
Thank you, Ms Moore. I do have one question for you, Ms Colbrand. Obviously, you've had experience of working for an IMB in a prison setting as well. We've had evidence throughout the inquiry, and there's been evidence prior to that. For one example is in Stephen Shaw's report, his 2016 report, about the particular vulnerabilities of detainees who don't speak English. So I'd like just to ask if you can tell me anything about some of the challenges that the IMB members face in interacting with detainees who are in that group. And if there's anything that you can kind of tell me about the comparison between those challenges at an IRC and in a prison setting, I'd find that really helpful.
Well, the population would be far more likely to speak foreign languages in an IRC than in a prison. So I don't really remember it being an issue in a prison. There were various. Personally speaking, I don't think I ever had a problem speaking to somebody, because if they had difficulties, if I couldn't use my own languages to help me out, a lot of the countries, if they didn't have English as a second language, they might have French, they might have Spanish, but if not, they would almost always have a friend, because they would support each other. So they would turn up two men, and he would say, "I've come to talk to you about my friend here, and this is his issue." So and then of course there was Language Line, which I don't think I ever needed to use it myself, but it was used in my presence at reviews by. I mean, the DCMs were very good at using it. They very often had to use it on a Rule 45 review. And actually, the biggest problem was when we had an app that was written totally in a language we didn't understand. That was really difficult. And then we would give it to Home Office to get it translated. But on the other hand, as long as you've got the name of the person, that didn't stop us going and actually starting to interact with the person and find out.
Did you have independent? Could you? Was that the only option available to you if you needed to get a translation done, to pass it to the Home Office?
Well, we weren't supposed to take the documents out, so we would have had to have gone through the official means somehow.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you've answered my question, but I'd just like to make sure of my understanding. So when you transitioned to working in an IMB in a prison to working in one in an IRC, was there any additional layer of training, anything else to prepare you as a member for the different needs of a population who's detained rather than imprisoned?
For me, no, because the situation was dire when I went in, and I just had to hit the ground running and apply myself to forming a board. So I had a handover day with the outgoing chair, and I had the National Council rep for the IRCs who volunteered to be on our board for 6 months while we got ourselves straight. And so obviously she had a lot of experience of the IRCs, and she was there for me for whatever I needed. But I learnt on my feet. People coming in afterwards, the people that we managed to recruit, even if the experienced IMB members would have an introduction and would be given a period of shadowing and so on to help them. We could afford to give them a little bit more time by then.
Thank you. I have no other questions for you. Thank you very much. I appreciate you coming today to give evidence. I know it's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but it's been important to hear from you, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It's 5:02 now, so if we come back at 12:10 for Miss Molyneux's evidence.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you, Ms Moore.
Thank you, Chair. Next, we have the evidence of Miss Molyneux.
Can you just repeat after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Please take a seat. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Miss Molyneux.
Hello.
Could you confirm for us your full name?
Yes, my name is Mary Bridget Molyneux.
And you have the folder of documents in front of you, which I might show on screen or refer you to, and your witness statement is there at tab 1.
Yes.
That was the statement you made to the inquiry and signed on the 13th of February 2022. And Chair, I'd ask for that to be adduced in full.
Indeed,
It's IMB 000203. So we'll just focus then on key issues and not go through everything in
Sure.
the statement. At page 1 of your statement, you describe your background, which is in law. So you qualified and practiced in Sydney as an attorney, and then you moved to London to take up in-house and general counsel roles. In May 2016, you became a non-executive director of a not-for-profit provider of care homes and housing for older people, which you did, I think, up to September 2021.
Yeah.
And as to your involvement in the IMB, you were appointed a member in January 2015, and you discussed joining a little at paragraph 4. But can you tell us how you became aware of the existence of the IMB?
As I say, I wanted to do public sector work and also some not-for-profit work. And to be honest, I did not know about IMBs, but a friend who works in civil service suggested I look at, I can't remember which particular aspect of the civil service website, and I saw a lot of them there. And I was interested in the immigration aspects rather than, for example, prison aspects.
Mm-hmm. And was the choice of Brook House because that was geographically the best one for you?
Yes, I was within the range where usually they want members within about a 40-mile range, I think, yeah.
Yes. And at page 3, paragraph 7 to 8, you discuss the training, and you discuss, as I've discussed with Ms Colbrand already, there's a year's probation, and it includes training on the IMB's duties and powers, including in relation to rotor visits and recording, you say, serious incidents, segregation and applications. And then you say the term application, or sometimes app, I think it's said, is used by the IMB to include both complaints and requests made to the IMB.
To us, yeah.
And your initial training also included training on the existence of rules 35, 40 and 42.
Yes.
And you also discussed shadowing visits, and like Miss Colbrand, was that shadowing a number of different people?
Yes, I think probably everybody who was on the board, and some of them twice, but the idea was to get a range. There's no particular style, it was to get an idea of what other people did, yeah.
And in terms of the IMB's work at Brook House over the relevant period, which is April to August 2017, you cover this in your statement at some detail at pages 4 to 10. However, I've been over this already with Miss Colbrand about the nature of the role and the sort of day-to-day of the IMB's work. So rather than do the same with you, I'll summarise what you say the role is, remembering, of course, that we have your statement that explains it more fully. And when there's something new to ask you, we'll ask you about that. So paragraph 11, you discuss the legal underpinning and the fundamental purpose of the IMB, which is that their role is to ensure that detainees are treated safely and humanely, and that if they are not, the IMB is required to report this.
Yes.
And the sources of those powers and responsibilities, as you say, are both the detention centre rules and also OPCAT, so the UN's optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhumane and degrading treatment and punishment. So on a practical level then, you discuss the Rotor system and access to the centre, and you tell us that IMB's visits were always unannounced.
Yeah.
You personally visited Brook House 13 times during the relevant period from consulting your records?
Yeah.
Spending most of your time, you say, on the wings and collecting either written or ad hoc verbal applications. And Miss Colbrand discussed the Secretariat using a formula to calculate how many visits are allowed. Essentially, it seems that there's limitations for budgetary purposes on how many visits can be done by the IMB to a particular centre in a year. Is that what your understanding?
Yes, I don't think that I ever saw that as a restriction of how many rotor visits. It might have an impact on, for example, if you wanted to go in and go to a meeting, a governance meeting, or maybe look at something on a report. But yes, we were conscious there was budget or a visit limit number, yeah.
Is that still the case now?
No. Oh, sorry, it might be, but we don't take, I shouldn't say it, don't take any notice of it. I think there is not a restriction in that sense. If we want to go in, we go in. I also think that, I call it budget, but it's more related to expenses. It's been increased significantly. I'm not sure if it was before Panorama, but certainly after.
So they're more frequent Rotor visits now?
That's hard to say because of COVID. You know,
Of
the last
course,
few
yes.
years, even though we've kept going in, it's not to the same extent as before. And also the numbers in the centre, you know, less than half what they were at the time then.
Imagining a future without COVID and with a, you know, let's say a relatively full Brook House, how many visits per week do you think it would be appropriate?
I would expect I would be going in twice a week, not being chair. As a chair, there would be more. It varies though. Some members, it's quality, not quantity. Some members might get round, you know, in one day, one visit. Some might break it up over multiple days. But yeah. But I would expect them to pick up again post-COVID. Yeah.
Yes. We looked at some Rotor reports with Miss Colbrand, and the format of those previous reports, they were the ones that were in use during the relevant period. And as you know, because you discuss it, I believe, in your statement, Professor Bosworth, our expert, one of our experts, said in her first report, there is no evidence in the IMB material of an explicit engagement with human rights, either as a legal framework or as a set of principles and values. She said this terminology simply doesn't appear. Instead, their members' reports offer brief descriptions of time spent in parts of the centre. The form is divided into areas of Brook House. It does not follow a thematic, rights-based approach. So that's the forms that were in use during the relevant period. Were they, the blank forms, were they created centrally or were they made for Brook House? Do you remember? Or do you know?
Oh, we created our own. I think there are samples on the National IMB members' website, but it varies from centre to centre, I think, yeah. Or it has in the past. I think there's a move to maybe get more consistency, as I understand, but at the time that was ours.
You've provided now the new form, because the new form is now in use. So can I ask for this to be shown on screen and we can take a look? It's IMB 000200. And it's a blank form, but we can see the headings. It will appear, don't worry. It's not, your screen's not broken, it's just, just wait a moment.
Okay.
There we go.
Yeah.
So we see it starts with an executive summary, a list of serious incidents, and then there's a heading safety, under which there's various entries including suicide and self-harm, vulnerability and safeguarding, use of force. There's a heading fair and humane treatment, which includes escorts, accommodation, separation. Would that be removal from association or something else?
Yeah.
Complaints and property, and then there's health and well-being, which encompasses physical and mental health care, an overleaf there. Welfare and social care, exercise and time out of room, preparation for release or return, a list then of applications, meetings attended, and a kind of follow-up, so that's your action points to carry forward, I understand, and then you include the name. So was this form provided, was this form created locally at Brook House, or was it?
Yeah, no, we introduced it, I can't remember exactly when, but it was probably about April 2020.
What was there a particular driver for introducing the new format?
It was, again, something that came out of COVID. We did visit all through COVID, but we did less visits, and they were much more focused, time on the wings, you know, time trying to engage with men rather than seeing some of the other areas. And we just felt that the old form wasn't working to have that area-by-area approach. So we went to this, which follows the format of the IMB annual reports, which came in a few years ago. And so it's a much more thematic approach.
Have you shared this with any other IMBs?
Yes, we have, and there is a move, and this was at an IMB study day just a few weeks ago. Damon Owers mentioned it, and I know the National Management Board has been looking at introducing something like this, but certainly a thematic approach, probably like this for all IMBs in the detention estate and perhaps prisons, I'm not sure. But it has been shared, and it's going to be shared more widely, yeah.
Did you have or provide training on the use of the new form as opposed to the old form?
As I said, it follows the annual report template, which was nationally introduced. That's not a local thing. And there was training for that at the time, and also there is also a guide that comes with it that will give prompts and areas. So the people are familiar with the annual report process, and this is a natural, I think, flow on from that.
And your view, according to your statement, is that it's led to a sharper focus on human rights and that it helps create stronger evidence-based reports.
I think you have, yes, I think it has been a very good introduction. I think it came by happenstance, perhaps with COVID, but it has been. You have to think about what you're seeing, where it fits, which particular issue it is, and it's not a human rights checklist, but human rights inform all those areas. So yes, I do think it's an improvement. Yeah.
And if you're able to give any examples of perhaps how it's played out practically, so where that method of recording something might lead to the identification of a concern that perhaps wouldn't have been picked up on an old report. Can you give us an example of that?
Well, it can be just before you might have gone on to C-wing, for example, and there might have been some kind of disturbance and men perhaps very agitated about something. And in the past we might have just recorded it that way. Now you have to think, well, what was that about? What was it? Was it an issue with, a Home Office not seeing them, things like that? So I think it does make you think, what are the issues, what's driving some of these things we're seeing, yeah. And
is there anything done differently compared to the relevant period about what happens to the forms after they're completed? So I think they're shared with Serco, aren't they? And are they also shared with the Home Office?
Yeah, so it goes as before. The IMB clerk distributes, and the benefit of that is they'll keep as a permanent soft copy record then. But yes, it goes to local Home Office. It also goes to the two most senior people at Serco. It also goes to PPG, who's the healthcare provider.
Yep. And what about internally within the IMB? Are they recorded, and is there any kind of trend analysis done? So when you look at that compared to older reports, can you spot trends, and if so, how?
The trend analysis, we do trend analysis, and it's more focused on looking at what's in the combined monthly reports. I think, so we do that. Every month we see that. It's a 12-month rolling on things like ACDTs, use of force. On trend analysis or themes, I suppose, from IMB reports, I mean, certainly as chair, I would be tracking them regularly during the year, but I suppose the main point is midpoint of the year where we review, and then towards the end of the year where we're pulling those themes from there for the annual report. And
how are you tracking them? Is it just by way of reading and absorbing it, or do you create a separate document that plots these trends?
For the ones from the Rotor reports, for the ones from the combined monthly report, it's a page, snapshot, a couple of pages, comes with about 8 items on them. For this, I would have my own notes. I'd have just mirror headings and just trying to put things into there from the Rotor reports into there. Yeah. And
you just mentioned combined reports. So we saw an example with Ms. Colbrand from April 2017, and these are data on things like ACDT, but also length of detention, and the charter flights that are due to take place are listed on these reports as well. Would it be right to assume that some of the applications or complaints you got from detained people were less about life at Brook House and more about immigration status concerns?
At the back of our annual report and other IMB's annual reports for each year, it gives a breakdown of applications. And I think for every year I've been on the IMB, immigration-related matters are probably the highest, than healthcare. So yes, a lot of them, and the same is true of informal reports. Most of the issues are immigration-related, I would say. And
you gave an interview to Verita on the 31st of May 2018. I don't need to bring it up, but you've seen the notes of that. And you were asked about the IMB's role in dealing with individual complaints. And as an example, the temperature of a room is discussed, and you say, well, I don't just say, that's not our area. I would go and find the person who can deal with facilities and speak to them. And then
did I say that?
I think you say, we'd go and speak to facilities. We'd bring someone from G4S to the room if necessary. And you don't just tell the detainee it's facilities' job and not ours.
Oh, no.
And then you say it can sometimes be hard to see where the line is drawn. So you say even immigration cases, we're not meant to have an immigration remit. There's never a rota where you're going to the Home Office asking Mr. X says this, Mr. X is concerned about his departure arrangements. You say they're forthcoming, you go back in again, but you have to be a bit careful with some of those things because sometimes the detainee doesn't know themselves when their date is. I just want to ask about the idea of an immigration remit. First, is the quote from the interview correct? As your understanding, you're not meant to have an immigration remit as such?
I think those are the key words, not supposed to. But the reality, or not meant to, but that was, I think it's something of a myth. I think, but I suspect it's founded in, I've forgotten, is it Detention Centre Rule 61 something, where it says we're not to concern ourselves with an individual's case. I also say in my witness statement. I've never heard somebody quote that back at me. And I think the reality is we are always dealing with immigration issues. We are up talking to the Home Office about individual cases. So it's one of those, I don't know where the line is, but nobody's never told, I've never been stopped from doing anything.
You've never been told you've crossed it.
Yeah, no. And we're not going to go and ask and say, I want to see all the records on this man, or become an advocate in the sense of, or an advocate in an informal sense, but not in the sense that I'm going to be taking this man's case up and I'm going to continue it. But I would say that's a stronger view now than it was. My view is a stronger view now than it was in 2017.
In what sense?
Well, I think because you did hear these remarks, we don't have an immigration remit. I wouldn't say that now. I might say there's 61.5 or whatever it is, but it's something you have to be conscious of and perhaps work around at times. But we are looking at those matters, and I think we should be looking at them.
You consider that it's part of the IMB's role?
Yes, I think it's the thing that it is the most important factor for men in Brook House, is their immigration status and matters related to the Home Office and how it's being handled. Yes, I do.
And you discuss at 39 to 40, so this is page 13 of your statement, the Home Office's presence at Brook House. So you mentioned the DET, the Detainee and Engagement Team, and you describe them as a link between the detainees and their caseworkers. I'll just let you turn it up, page 13.
Yeah.
So they're the link between detainee on one hand and caseworker, the decision maker, on the other. Do you consider that they are an effective link between the detainees and their caseworkers?
I was optimistic when it used to be called the pre-departure team, but the detainee engagement team came in because it is a problem. Access to caseworkers is one of the biggest problems, I think, or men feeling they don't have access. I don't think it's worked out as well as probably I personally had hoped. I think now too often it can be another layer. They're not decision makers. If you go and ask the detainee engagement team something, they will have to look at their database, they will have to get information. It would be much better if there were caseworkers on site or caseworkers more accessible. But the DET team is better than nothing. Sorry, better than nothing is disparaging. It's not meant that way. The DET team is there. It is not as effective as it could be, and it's not as good as caseworkers on site or caseworkers being more accessible.
Have you ever suggested that caseworkers be based at Brook House?
That's been discussed before. I think going back as far as Stephen Short was suggested they should at least meet each person. I don't think that's happened. It was for a while. I think it must have been before COVID, but quite a while, that as part of their caseworkers would come for a period of time. I don't think that's ever happened. I would certainly advocate it now. But, yeah.
I want to ask next about HMIP. So you discuss this at pages 50 to 51 of your statement, at paragraphs 140 onwards. And you set out the limited contact between the IMB and HMIP during the relevant period, but you note that it was nevertheless productive. So I understand you were watching Miss Colburn's evidence earlier this morning. I asked her about an email that she sent to Mr. Singbui following the 2016 inspection, in which she said that she had discussed with the board the IMB's opinion, and this is not a quote, this is my summary, but that the HMIP marks were perhaps ungenerous. Do you remember being part of a discussion between the board about approaching HMIP about the marking?
I do remember, but what I remember, so yes, it is true. It is correct. All the board were involved. I remember more the bit about the education teacher. But yes, no, I was involved in that, yeah.
Do you have a view now on the appropriateness of that correspondence?
I don't think it's appropriate.
Why not?
I don't think the IMB should be, trying to, unless there was something we felt they'd really omitted, but you wouldn't write a letter. That would have been discussed when HMIP was on site. I don't think the IMB should be making suggestions to an independent body about its findings.
We also heard from Mr. Singbui yesterday, and he was asked by Mr. Livingston about some correspondence from not long after the relevant period. And this was an occasion where someone at HMIP took a call on the 3rd of May 2018 and emailed Mr. Singbui as follows. I've just taken a call from a new employee at Brook House. He wants to remain anonymous. He told me he had just completed the initial training course and had only been given keys and a radio and placed on a wing for a week and was already having new staff shadowing him. He told me that one of the new staff, a woman, had been sexually assaulted by an inmate. He complained that there was very short-staffed and unable to take breaks as a result, and that the centre was out of control and volatile. he was concerned about the safety of staff. And it looks like Mr Singbury telephoned you and then followed it up as well with a written note of the call. And he added that in a recent inspection of Tinsley, one of the main issues was short notice redeployment and people feeling unprepared. And he said, if you do verify this, I would be interested to hear about it. Now, Mr Livingston asked him yesterday, did you receive any further information on this? And he said he didn't recall whether or not he did. He expects that if he did, it would have been in the disclosure, but he didn't remember. Can you help us with this? Do you recall this?
Yeah, I do recall it. I recall both his call and the email. When asked about it last night, I immediately remembered. I think it was a May long weekend. I went to Michelle Smith at the Home Office with it, and I went to Michelle Brown, who was the duty director of G4S at that time. Before I went to them, I had a conversation with Mr Singbury about, just to be sure that I could make those contacts. I didn't know what his source had said, whether there were any concerns about confidentiality. Yeah. I recall that G4S Michelle Brown did follow it up. She came back to me. I can't remember the specifics of it, but I do recall her coming back. What I don't recall is whether I closed the loop with Mr Singbury. I might have papers at home. I only heard about this last night. But yes, I definitely got it, followed up with it. And the only bit I can't remember is whether I closed the loop with him.
Okay, and what did Michelle Brown say to you when you raised it with her?
That's my recollection. I'd have to look at notes. All I can, I do remember her coming back because I remember about the member of staff who there'd been a concern had been assaulted. My recollection is there were actually some concerns with her behaviour that potentially had put her in, a position she shouldn't have been in. I do remember that, and that I can't remember more.
Do you remember anything about the potential unpreparedness of somebody who'd been there a week and then had someone shadowing him? Do you recall discussing that?
I do remember Michelle Brown addressing it. I can't remember what was said. I can't at this point remember.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you do have correspondence around that, it may be something that the inquiry is
sure,
in touch with
I can check when I get home.
I want to ask next then about applications. So you discuss these at 44 to 45 at your page 14. I'll ask for a blank form to be shown on the screen so we can get an idea of how they work. So it's IMB 000081. And this is how a detainee, one of the methods by which a detainee could get in touch with the IMB. Is this the form that's still in use now? As far as you know?
Look, there's a newer version that's got GDPR language on it, but the language of custody officer is prison-based, but that is the essence of it, and I think at the back side are their actions that we took, but it's right. Much the same, yeah.
The first page, I think, is for the detained person to fill in, and the back side is to say what
actions we took.
Actions been taken, yes. Is this form available in other languages other than English?
No, it's not. It's not. And a man doesn't have to use a form. Sometimes we just get a piece of paper, but no, it's not in other languages.
And I think the chair asked Ms Colburn about what if it was completed in a different language, because it could sometimes somebody could complete the form in their own language that you obviously might not understand. What's done when that happens?
I heard that. I can't recall any maybe apps myself that I picked up in a foreign language. I do remember seeing complaints made against when they go through a translation process, and we see that. I can't remember. If I got one in that language, in a language other than English, obviously you can't go and ask. They're for the IMB. You can't go and ask Serco G4S. I'd go back and talk to the man and see if he had a friend who could help translate for me.
I think that Ms Colburn's answer, although I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, was that this could be shared with the Home Office to be translated.
I didn't know then if I wouldn't do that with an app. With complaints that are made against G4S or Serco, they go through a translation process, and we see the translation. Yeah, so I'm not quite sure there whether we were talking about the same thing.
And if you're not getting any that are filled in a foreign language, only them in English, as far as you can recall, does that potentially suggest to you that people who can't write in English aren't using the process at all?
Perhaps not the formal process, certainly on the wings when we go around. I address this and acknowledge this. This is an issue. It's a barrier for people generally. But on going around on the wing, or it might just say, what does happen, I'd forgotten this, what does happen it might just say, I need help, or please see me,
Mhm.
you know, just written in English. Then you would go, sorry, I'd forgotten that. That's how those that weren't in English would come up, yeah.
That does still require the ability to write something in English, doesn't it? But less.
Yeah, I've had some that just say help, see me, yeah.
And as you say, the second page is just for a reply.
Yeah.
I believe that there was a problem with these forms' availability on the wings that we've seen in notes during the relevant period.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
What was done about that?
It was a constant chasing exercise with G4S at that time. We would also, even though it was their responsibility, we would just end up taking stocks of them ourselves on our rounds and replenishing ourselves. And it was going to, I went to Jules Williams a number of times because at that time he was in charge of residents, and it was their responsibility. But it was a constant, it seemed like a constant problem. But we would basically try to just replenish ourselves. We'd bring in stocks, we'd take them when we went round. Yeah.
Did you ever receive an explanation as to why this was such an issue?
It was always, they should be, they will be, they were done, then it would fall away. I think it was one of those things that just staff overworked, staff not, you know, properly told to do this. But I've said in my statement I don't believe it was anything deliberate.
But it keeps happening. It's mentioned in the Rotor reports that they're not seen there, and it's mentioned at meetings. Did you, or do you know if anyone else took any steps to escalate it above just discussing it in the monthly meetings?
Well, it came up at our board meetings, so the most senior, both a local Home Office and G-Force were aware of it. And it was just incredibly frustrating, and we just kept working at it, yeah.
How about now?
No, and it's a habit probably from those days. It's still, we check the racks, you know, when we go around. I don't see it as a problem now, no.
You have a much smaller population now, and obviously your visits are a bit different because of COVID, I understand. But what about thinking back to just before the pandemic? Was it a problem then, or had it already been resolved by then?
I can't remember. If it was a problem, it was certainly not to the extent it had been before. And you know, there've been more staff also since Serco has come in, and we did keep visiting during the pandemic. It was just just not as many days a week, for example. But yeah, no, I don't see it as a problem now, but always keep an eye out for it.
With the first report of Professor Bosworth, one of the experts to the inquiry, has considered these forms as well as HMIP data gathering. And she says it would be best if a simplified complaints form could be made available to the detained population in multiple languages. She said it could, for example, be standardised and organised around common concerns with closed-ended questions as well as an open text section. And she says that if those standardised complaint forms existed, the language barrier would be less significant, as its gist could be understood at a glance. And she mentions that this technique is commonly used in other surveys, and it could be added to kiosks. She says the kind of issues that could be included in a redesigned complaints form could include lost property, staff language and behaviour, roommates, bullying, food, drugs, and information about the individual's immigration case. So possibly entries and then a tick box, and then you can add more information. These wouldn't just be easy to fill in, but they'd be easier to see at a glance what kind of concerns come up. And she suggests redesigning the form in consultation with the IMB, Home Office, private contractors and representatives from the detained population. What do you think of that suggestion?
When I first saw the suggestion, I thought, well, why would you force a detained man whose English is not necessarily very good anyway into something? Why not let him just free text? But I understand now, I've read a little more and understand it can be useful for you know, data gathering, surveying, and also it would be helpful for us as well as outside people. So I think that's something that could be looked at, yeah. And the free text is there still too, so yeah.
And not just, you say it could be difficult if your language isn't English, but part of the suggestion is to make them available in multiple languages.
Yeah.
You can't get all the languges because there's so many.
No, we need to
but
identify key languages. We do, do you want me to tell you some other things? You know, the language barrier is difficult. It's always there. It's something that has to be looked at all the time because there's a new shifting population, and we have ourselves. This is not on the apps forms, but it's something we've had kind of like an icebreaker card with what is the IMB, what we do in about, I think it's about 15 languages that we'll start to use to at least get conversation going.
When did that come into force?
No, we've only just had it done.
Just had it made,
Yeah.
so it hasn't been
No,
circulated
it hasn't.
Okay.
So I think, but we need to look more like the apps forms. I think it's something always on our list, but we can do better there.
So that's a very recent decision to introduce the icebreaker card. What gave rise to that decision?
Some of it was, it's since we started also monitoring Tinsley House, and in the last year or so, Tinsley House has mainly been really almost exclusively used as a short-term holding facility for men who've come pretty much straight from Dover, asylum seekers. So we have found there are less speakers of English there generally. So it's that, but we'll use it at both places. There are also now too, even though there's always an issue with Wi-Fi in Brook House in particular, but there are Google Translate tablets we use. So there are things, but I think our apps forms are something we should look at too.
On the volume of the applications, you discuss this in your statement at 48. You simply say that in the whole of 2017, the IMB received 123 applications requiring follow-up. This was at a time of a full population, obviously, compared to now. And in 2018, 142. Again, I think just those requiring follow-up. That's about 1 every 3 days in 2017. Do you think that those numbers are representative of the level of issues people had at the time?
No, I don't. They first of all, they are just the formal written apps, as we've said. I think I've said in my statement, and Jackie Colburn said it too. We get at least as many going round, and then there's a whole grey area of things that we would never consider an app, but are involved in just helping things like there's no fax machine, there's something like that. But so that number is not representative, and I think even when you factor in the ad hoc apps, I'd say it's probably an underestimation of the issues because of the barriers we mentioned of access, whether it's language or people concerned about who the IMB is, not having confidence in the process. So no.
I understand that you've heard the evidence of detained persons live or via some of their summaries, many of whom said they haven't heard of the IMB. And you've discussed the icebreaker card, which is obviously one way of making people aware of the IMB. Do you have any other, has anything else changed since since the relevant period to make people aware of the IMB?
On awareness, sorry, it's going to sound like COVID, but we've also ensured that the IMB is mentioned in the induction when men first arrive, and there's also a house rules booklet that Serco has now produced, I think, in 22 languages, and the IMB is mentioned in that, so every man gets that. So that's the beginning, the initial, but we have to do more work. And we are looking at what we do next, and I think some of it is from here, probably mainly driven by hearing the evidence here. It's really heightened it. Our next way of trying to tackle it is we will say, for example, target particular areas like welfare or perhaps GDWG, and with them inform them more about what we do and can they refer back. Now we have done that with years for welfare, but we need to do something more, we recognise, and so that's the next kind of way we're looking at.
Just lastly on the point of applications, we have a number of statements from Ms Pincus of GDWG, and I understand you've seen her fourth statement in particular. At paragraph 68, she suggests, GDWG recommend that on receipt of an application, IMB's first check response is not with officers, but with the detained person who submitted the application.
I was surprised at that because the first step is talking to the man who's written it, and I think I say that in my thing. You just, even if it's a detailed app, and most of them aren't, you really need to go to him and just understand what his issues are. So I agree with it, and we're doing it, yeah.
Ms Colburn already helped us with a number of issues about use of force. One thing I wanted to ask about, just from you, is your something you say in your statement about documentation of use of force. So you say the IMB should be given access to all use of force documentation and Rule 40 and 42 reports. But you add, however, the receipt of use of force paperwork from G4S and then Serco has been an issue almost the entire time I have been an IMB member, either not being copied in or not getting it in a timely manner. Can you help us with that? What paperwork are you lacking?
Not now, but except it's very rare now and can be corrected right away. We get use of force, the full use of force reports on a daily basis now. But in the past, yes, it was getting hard copies of the use of force reports. it's a bit like, or we weren't getting them, even though we were asking for them. It's a bit like the reason or explanation for why application forms weren't on the wings. I think overworked staff, those forms are very bulky, people didn't seem to want to copy them. You could see, you know, it's been raised, it was raised with Steve Skid, who spoke to the Oscars, it still didn't happen. It was just another constant battle. There will be days when we don't get use of force reports, and you know you don't get them because you've been called by the Oscar to say there's use of force, and there's no report. Whereas we know, you know, Home Office usually gets them the next day. So we will call now to the senior management team person who's in charge, and they come over. But they're pretty much daily now, or whenever the use of force is.
How often is it that you are informed of a use of force but you don't receive the form, roughly?
Now, it's rare now. It's rare. Yeah.
You, at page 31 of your statement, paragraphs 97 to 98, give an example of a specific missing use of force report. So this, I believe, isn't about paperwork existing but not being copied to you, but rather no paperwork being done. So this relates to D1255.
Yeah.
And in short, you witnessed force being used on a detainee, I think by a DCO, and
Yeah.
you say you were surprised not to receive a use of force report. Did you ever receive one in this case, do you remember?
No, I don't know. I don't think there was one. That was the point. Yeah.
You say overleaf at 98, you discussed the lack of use of force report with the chair and made a decision to record it in your Rotor report. That way it would go to the Home Office in G4S. But they're not required to take any action, are they? They're just notified of it by that process.
We can't make them take any action. I would expect that, you know, Rotor reports are raising issues. They're escalating issues, but I can't make them do anything. But I would expect they should. But there wasn't a report, no.
Is there anything that you would do differently now if you saw a use of force and then a form didn't come to you?
I would. I think, you know, I'm glad I recorded in my Rotor report. But I think now that there should have been, I would go to senior management.
As a more general point, and we can go to examples, or you might recall examples that I went to with Miss Colbran, was there, during the relevant period, a practice of writing concerns in Rotor reports or mentioning them at meetings and considering that the job of raising the issue had been done, against which you now say you'd go to management? Do you consider that was different from the relevant period to how it is done now?
No, the approach with Rotor reports and our role is similar. Or the same. That is the nature of what we do. You know, we have to monitor and we have to report. The Rotor report's a report, and I think I say in my witness statement that is a form of escalation. You don't have to put a big note on it saying they're there. We have to report. They go to senior management, and as I've said, we can't make them take action. But so that is similar. There are some, you know, the missing missing use of force now. With and I regret I didn't do it then. I think Brook House, the awareness, a missing use of force report is a problem. It's anywhere, but particularly with Brook House with its history. So I would go to Steve Hure or Sarah Newland, the Centre Director and Deputy Director. And I would record in the road report. That is something that's serious enough. You just go and talk to people too. Yeah.
And why do you think it wasn't considered at the time serious enough to take to that sort of level of seniority?
Well, it was my decision. I did speak with Jackie, the chair. As I said, I feel I should have done both, particularly given this was a very vulnerable man. I guess my decision was I thought it was better to have a record. I'm not quite sure what would have been done, if anything, if I'd just gone and had a conversation.
The record, though, requires then assuming that G4S and Home Office are going to go on to apply adequate scrutiny to their decisions. So you say something wrong has happened potentially, but you're hoping and requiring that they will then go and fix it, aren't you, by just recording it in a Rotor report?
But that, I think, again comes back to what the IMB's role is. I mean, if there's something of a thematic nature or we see recurring, then you can see that we keep we just don't say, I've written about that, I'm off. It's, you can see we follow, we persist, but their role is to deal with issues that are raised about them and weaknesses in their system. And yes, we will track, but we're not going in each week saying, have you done that, have you done that? They have compliance team.
I want to ask now about Rule 35. So you had an interest in this, I think, possibly due to your legal background, but you were the one who asked, we heard from Ms Colbrand, for the disaggregated data on the type of Rule 35s that were being done. So you asked for Rule 35.1 to be separated from 2, for example, and you were rebuffed.
No, I don't recall I was rebuffed.
Well, it wasn't provided to you.
Well, maybe because there are none.
Yeah,
But-
that's possibly true.
Which is why we raised the issues, weren't there so many? No, I do remember going and asking, could it be broken out? We asked for this we wanted new information. How
Yeah.
many use of force reports, not use of force, Rule 35s. And I think you can see from the note I did that it's a difficult area to get into. It's kind of a closed world, confidentiality, or it can be a barrier. So we thought we'd look at it start by looking at data. And I did ask if it could be broken into a 35 1, 2, and 3, because in the healthcare office, and talking to Sandra Culver, she showed me they had different folders. And so I knew that it could be broken. And I think, and yes, subsequently looking, we did get information, and when I've looked at it in the combined monthly report, I realise it's pretty much release rates. And I think it's because, thinking about it, it's because there were no 1s, 2s, and 3s. And, 3s, no 1s and 2s, or very few.
Very few 1s, no 2s.
Yeah, and that then could be confirmed when finally, months later, you could look at Home Office public data on the website and see that there were hardly any.
So did you look at Home Office public data to
Yeah, it was
ascertain?
available quarterly, and I'd look, it showed other centres too, and that's realised there's an issue across other centres too, yeah.
You mentioned patron confidentiality, which obviously might preclude you from seeing some of the things on the forms, but
Yeah.
that wouldn't preclude you, would it, from seeing data about the number of reports that fell under each of the subheadings?
No.
Do you remember who you asked for that data?
To be shown.
Yep.
It would be in the Home Office as part of the combined monthly report. So at the time, I don't know. I guess probably it was Paul Gasson at the time. I can't remember the precise person I had. It was in a board meeting. I think we said we want this kind of data.
So you have it in the combined reports, so as we see the number of Rule 35 reports, and you said, can that break it down?
No, I think the number of Rule 35. Oh, sorry, yeah, it was there before. Yes, I asked, can we have that broken into categories, and also can we see the release rates?
Yeah.
You know,
And that wasn't done.
we got release rates, but not the breakout.
You've been provided with a transcript of, before we go on to general Rule 35 issues, I want to ask you about specific matters. So the first was the live evidence of D643. You've been provided also with his evidence and statement, but in summary, he gave live evidence to the inquiry in this phase, and he had been to see Dr. Uzarali on the 26th of April 2017. And we see from his notes, his medical records, that Dr. Uzarali recorded a change in behaviour and that there were PTSD triggers. This is a man who was a veteran and had combat-related PTSD. And Dr. Uzarali said that Rule 35 was not necessary at the time. D643 was recognised at the time as an adult at risk. By October 2017, he was on an open ACDT. He was assessed as an adult at risk level 2. And he says in his statement to the inquiry, I can see from the documents disclosed by the inquiry that the Brook House Independent Monitoring Board meeting on the 18th of October 2017, the following was noted. LH wanted to get more information from PG on D643 Rule 35 report on his mental health concerns. Agreed to follow this up on her Rotor visit. And then he says, I don't know who refers to, but I can see from my medical records I was receiving no attention from healthcare at this time. Around this time I stopped taking my medication, etc. Are you able to help us with your role in that? I presume that you're the only
Yeah, I am. I can't recall. I've looked back. I've also looked at my notebooks. LH was one of my board colleagues, Louis Huey. I can't remember what prompted Louis to ask for more. I said I'd pick it up, I presume, because I was actually on Rotor duty that week, and so I said I'd pick it up. But I cannot find a record of myself doing that, and I think it was Louise Gledhill then picked it up a few weeks later.
D643 said he never actually saw anyone from the IMB, though. So do you know in what sense she picked it up? What did she do next?
Sorry, I heard his evidence. I thought he meant the IMB generally, that he'd never seen us, whereas
Yeah.
I, in fact, remember, meeting him in conversations a number of times, probably just generally, but not on this particular point, no.
Okay. And then at page 26 of your statement, paragraph 80, you refer to a Rotor note which was made in late August, in the week commencing the 27th of August 2017. I won't bring up the note because you summarise it. You say, I note that I had asked whether, in a case where a person had indicators of PTSD, a nurse might volunteer to him that he should seek a Rule 35 assessment. I was told not, because it was not considered a right. I made a note that a more open approach to the issue might be in the best interests of potentially vulnerable detained persons. Do you now think that Rule 35 is a right?
I thought it was a right then. It was healthcare who didn't think. I was asking them, I'd had a conversation with a man who mentioned PTSD, and I said, well, have you had a Rule 35? And I think he said, no, so that's why I went to healthcare, and it was they. I said to him, have you had a Rule 35? And I was pretty startled by their response that it's not a right. I think I said that.
And what you did was record that in your Rotor report?
I think I said at the time to the nurse. Sorry, I don't know if it was a nurse. I can't remember now if it was. It wasn't someone I know, or remember, like Chrissy Williams or one of the others. But it was someone in there.
It doesn't say in your report whether it was a nurse, it just says somebody.
I looked back through my notes to see if I could find who it was. I don't remember who it was.
But so you recorded that concern in your Rotor report. Did you think about taking any further steps? So you should be thinking, shouldn't you, hang on, this nurse might be seeing people whose behaviour or presentation should be ringing alarm bells about the things that are set out in Rule 35, likely to be injured, suicidal or victim of torture. And as this conversation's told you, he or she isn't going to necessarily refer them or tell them to seek an appointment. That should have been really concerning, shouldn't it?
On reflection, I should have spoken at least to Sandra Culver, who was head of healthcare, if that didn't get anywhere, to Home Office, yes.
More generally then on Rule 35, before we break for lunch, you discuss this in your statement at page 21, in the bottom half of that page. And you cover at paragraph 66 the process for Rule 35 and the legal framework. You say that although there is a presumption that highly vulnerable people such as torture victims should not be in detention, Home Office decision makers can use immigration factors to override the presumption. There is no transparency on this decision-making process, and the board has concerns about the relatively high number of men who continue to be detained even after the Home Office has accepted their Rule 35 claim.
Yeah.
Who have you raised these concerns with?
Well, that's an issue in our annual reports.
Yeah.
It also can, it's a high number, even where they do Rule 35, so 35.3s, the far and away the most men, it's still the issue now, are kept as level 2 adults at risk. They're not released. We ask it at adults at risk meetings if we attend them, but you can see what happens. It's people, and it's a Home Office issue. They're still there.
As well as raising it, as we see that you do in the annual reports, which is in a sort of general sense that they're not resulting in high levels of release. Do you ever raise it in relation to an individual case?
It's most likely it would be in, when we join adults at risk meetings, or it's vulnerable residents, it's called now. You'd be asking, yes, I do remember asking at times, well, why is he still here? Why is he still here? And you might hear something from healthcare like, well, we can take care of him, and what's that got to do with it? You would hear that. They're the kind of instances I can recall, yeah.
So somebody in healthcare saying we can take care of him doesn't accord, in your view, with the purpose of Rule 35, which isn't to see
It
if...
doesn't say anything about that. It's not, yeah.
You go on immediately below in that same section to say another significant problem with Rule 35 is that 1 and 2 reports are very rare, and you say that the board has reported on those concerns, and you refer to the annual reports of 2019 and 2020. You say there's been no action on these issues. We'll need to repeat the recommendations in 2021. So you do, it's correct, raise it in the 2019 and 2020 report, and no doubt you will in the 2021 report.
Yeah.
I also have mentioned today that it was also raised in the 2016 report, and nothing has been done about this. Do you have any idea why that is the case?
Well, I know now, after listening to inquiry evidence, but I didn't before that know why there were so few. No.
And I don't want to put words in your mouth, so why don't you summarise for me what your view, having now seen the inquiry evidence, is about why there's such low levels of Rule 35 1 and 2 reports?
Well, because we've heard the evidence first from Sandra Culver and then from the two GPs that they were applying their own kind of threshold.
Were you aware of that at the time?
No, not at all.
Were you aware of the practice, as the evidence that you've just alluded to also shed light on, of Part Cs being used in place of Rule 35 reports?
You know, you hear mention of Part Cs, but Part Cs are used for the most mundane things as well. You know, this is not an example of a mundane thing, but Part Cs would be put in, for example, if people thought a man was going to be disruptive on his removable. Part Cs could be put in if his medication was changed. And so again, in adults at risk meetings in particular, we'll have to put in a Part C. So the database can be updated, or the caseworker knows that. But not that they were, I was going to say an alternative, but not that they were being used as the way to inform the Home Office about these things. No, not to that extent that it's being used, no.
In your statement at page 37, paragraph 111, you discuss the case of D3454, and quoting from your own note in that statement, you say, he has not had a Rule 35 assessment yet, but healthcare have submitted Part C saying he's not fit for detention. That's from the relevant period.
Yeah, I guess I've seen that now and looked again, and I suppose I probably mentioned Part C because they told me that, or I heard that on the wing. I remember when seeing the man, but it never occurred to me that, or we weren't aware, and it didn't occur to me because it just didn't fit with the rules, that was their way of dealing with it. I thought, well, they were putting in an update for the database, but the 35 would follow.
Right.
Yeah.
So in light of the evidence that you've now heard and the understanding you now have of the issues, you would accept, would you, that knowledge of Rule 35 during the relevant period at Brook House was inadequate?
Yes.
Is that still the case now?
Well, I think it's changing right now. I think even in the last week, a colleague who I asked her to check, who was on duty at Brook House, go and ask healthcare what their practice is now on Rule 35s, and they told her that they're getting a lot more requests already because of awareness at the inquiry about it. So staff are suggesting to people, and I did join the Vulnerable Residents Adults at Risk meeting, I think the week before last, and I heard the clinical lead, the senior nurse, say a number of times, we'll look at a Rule 35 1 or 2 for this.
Okay.
So it's changing right now, yeah.
As you say, you've written in your reports again and again about the low numbers of Rule 35 1 and 2s in particular. You've now learnt more about why that is, and one option, one outcome might be that changes and that numbers go up. If that doesn't happen, or doesn't happen in your view adequately, what else, if anything, can the IMB do to continue chasing that up, other than just write it in ongoing reports?
Well,
now you know more about why.
Yeah. No, when I heard this in Sandra Culver's evidence, I wrote to the current chair, Neil Beer, and say you should look at this, and also another member who's particularly interested in safeguarding issues. And off the back of that, he has said, we have to meet and work out how we're going to monitor this going forward, and how we change our practices. So yeah, it won't be just saying we're not getting them. It will be, yeah. Now we know why we're not getting them. We'll be looking and expecting more detail. Yeah.
That's the end of Rule 35, so I think it's probably a good time to pause for a lunch break. We're taking, because it's Friday, a slightly shorter lunch break today, so if we return at just around 10 to 2, please, and we'll continue with your evidence then.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
10 to 2. Thank you.
All right.